night. Thanks for your company. Good night.
Good evening. It's Monday, the 6th of June. Our top stories tonight. Boris Johnson's leadership on the line as the Conservatives trigger a confidence vote. Anthony Albanese talks trade and security while cycling with President Joko Widodo in Indonesia. 50 killed after gunmen storm a Catholic church in Nigeria. And the US and South Korea test fire ballistic missiles in response to Pyongyang's launches. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. Also tonight, are there any easy solutions to the global oil crisis? Well, the fate of the British Prime Minister will be known in a few hours from now when Conservative MPs will vote on whether they'll oust Boris Johnson from office. Mr Johnson's leadership has been under increasing pressure since he was found to have taken parties at number 10 Downing Street during COVID lockdown. Earlier today, the Conservatives' 1922 committee confirmed a vote will be taken after a sufficient number of Tory MPs asked for it.
Which is simply to say that the threshold of 15% of the parliamentary party seeking a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister has been passed. Therefore, a vote of confidence will take place within the rules of the 1922 committee. That vote will take place this evening in the House of Commons between 6 and 8 o'clock, and we will announce the result shortly thereafter. There will be arrangements for proxy votes for any colleagues who can't be present in person in Westminster, and we'll notify colleagues of those arrangements in the near future.
Let's go to London, where our Europe correspondent Nick Dole is standing by. Nick, many had thought that the Sue Gray report into the COVID lockdown parties didn't deliver a knockout blow to Boris Johnson. Why has this built up again?
Hi there, Bev. I think there's a number of factors as to why we've seen this come today. I guess one of them is just simple maths. A critical threshold of 54 letters was reached. That's 54 Conservative MPs writing letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister. And then under party rules, that simply triggers a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister. But why have we reached that critical threshold now after months of trying to get there? Well, I think there's a number of factors behind that too. We've seen more polling recently showing that many Conservative MPs would be trounced in an election if one were to be held in the coming months. More anecdotally, we saw over the weekend the Prime Minister facing some really embarrassing scenes where he was booed quite loudly by crowds at Queen's Jubilee celebrations. And these were, you know, Queen-loving, Union Jack-waving people. And I think that may have crystallised the issue in the minds of some of his colleagues that the Prime Minister is losing support amongst his key constituency. There is no one issue behind this, but at the centre is the Prime Minister's integrity and whether or not he can be trusted. It wasn't just the series of parties at number 10. It wasn't just the fact that he was fined for breaking his own rules. It wasn't just him standing up in Parliament saying that all rules had been followed, even when a report later found that there was a culture of rule breaking at number 10. I think it was a combination of all of them and, more importantly, the Prime Minister's reaction to it in the months since. So I think some MPs, certainly those saying that they won't support him, they're saying that their own constituents are saying that they really can't trust the Prime Minister, and that lack of trust has now got to such a critical level that he shouldn't stay in the top job.
So, as you pointed out, 54 letters required to hold this vote, but he needs 180 of his fellow MPs to vote against him. What do we understand about how the numbers are lining up for him? Well,
on paper, Boris Johnson should win this vote. as you say, it's taken some time to reach 54 signatures. 180 people are required to vote against him. So the Prime Minister might be feeling relatively confident. I think what is the real unknown is whether or not simply triggering this vote then means that support falls away in the coming hours and he could ultimately lose. I don't think anyone can say with any real certainty. One thing that is certainly going in his favour right now is that the vast majority of his senior colleagues are backing him. We've seen statement after statement from cabinet ministers saying that they support the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister will have his own chance to directly address his colleagues. He's already written a letter to them just in the last few hours, and he'll be speaking to them directly before the vote is held, and that'll be his chance to make his case to stay in the job.
Technically, if he survives today's vote, he should be safe for 12 months. But if we look back, historically, once a motion like this is brought, it can be the beginning of the end, can't it?
Definitely. There's a long history of Prime Ministers out there who have survived these kinds of votes, whether or not it's Theresa May, who faced a vote of no confidence and later resigned. Margaret Thatcher, well, she faced a direct leadership challenge and she survived that, but she went too. I don't think anyone thinks Boris Johnson is a normal politician, though, so it may be that even if he is badly damaged by this, even if he sees the writing on the wall, he may not leave the top job. And he's seen himself how much benefit just a few months can give him. I mean, his leadership was really on the ropes a few months back. Then the war in Ukraine came along and that certainly bought him some time. So the Prime Minister may well try to hang on. Another unknown is whether or not the rules might be changed, and some Conservative MPs have already left that open. Perhaps the party rules could be changed so that Boris Johnson can be ousted in the coming months, even if he survives the vote later on today.
Interesting. And Nick, is there an obvious successor to Boris Johnson?
Not really, and that's another thing in the Prime Minister's favour. Names like Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, also people like Dominic Raab, have been mentioned, but so far they have all been giving their support to the Prime Minister. So even if the Prime Minister loses, they could then obviously make the decision to stand for the leadership. But right now, they are backing him in.
Nick Dole in London, thank you so much, and I know you'll keep us up to date as the hours progress. Well, Anthony Albanese will go to the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali later this year. Now, this is despite the possible attendance by Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Prime Minister made the promise during his first state visit to Indonesia, where he and President Joko Widodo agreed to strengthen economic and strategic ties. Mr Albanese says he was deeply touched by the President's warm welcome. Our political reporter Jane Norman is in Jakarta.
Two leaders in tandem. Australia's new Prime Minister welcomed in unique style.
It's a bamboo bike. Beautiful bamboo bike.
A presidential nod to both men's humble beginnings. From bicycles to botany, and finally bilateral talks on the grounds of Bagore's lush presidential palace. Anthony Albanese's seeking the deepest of ties with Australia's largest neighbour and confirming he'll be back later this year.
I will attend the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali in November. The work of the G20 is critical at this time of global economic uncertainty.
I am happy that Indonesia is the destination for Prime Minister Albanese's first bilateral visit.
The Prime Minister's following a familiar flight path to his predecessors. It was Malcolm Turnbull who forged the closest of bonds with Jokowi.
Well, that's a very good idea. Great idea.
Paving the way for a trade deal to be inked by Scott Morrison. But still, Australia's economic partnership with this country of 270 million is yet to reach its full potential. So, Mr Albanese's brought reinforcements, frontbenchers including Australia's first Muslim cabinet minister and a bevy of business leaders.
We have enormous opportunity for growth. Indonesia is going to be a top 5 economy in the globe.
As the Prime Minister prepared to leave for Indonesia, fresh tensions flared with Beijing, with confirmation a Chinese fighter jet had come perilously close to downing an Australian Air Force plane over the South China Sea.
We regard the actions of China in this area as being an act of aggression and a dangerous act.
Indonesia's largest trading partner is China, but Jakarta has made it clear it's not picking sides in the great power rivalry playing out on its doorstep. But as the biggest democracy among Southeast Asian nations, Indonesia will be critical in defending the rules-based order in a region facing pressure from an autocratic Beijing. Jane Norman, ABC News, Jakarta.
Russia has launched a missile strike on Ukraine's capital Kiev for the first time in over a month. Russia says the strikes destroyed tanks supplied by Eastern European countries. But Ukrainian authorities dispute that, saying a train repair shop was hit that contained no military equipment. The Russian president has warned that any Western deliveries of longer-range rocket systems will prompt Moscow to strike new targets.
If they are going to be supplied, we'll make certain conclusions and use our own means of destruction, which we will have enough to strike at those targets which we have not yet been hitting.
Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky made his first visit to the Donbass region since the start of the invasion. At least 26 people have died after a bus plunged into a gorge in India's northern state of Uttarakhand. Police say there were 30 people on board and 4 of those rescued are in a critical condition. The bus was en route to a pilgrimage site when the incident occurred. Rescue operations have been launched, with the injured being taken to hospital. In Bangladesh, at least 49 people were killed in a large blaze at a container depot. Drone footage has captured rows of burnt-out shipping containers as efforts to extinguish the fire continued into a second night. At least 9 firefighters were among those killed and more than 200 people were injured. The cause of the container fire is not yet known. Bangladesh, though, has a history of industrial disasters, with monitoring groups blaming corruption and lax safety standards. At least 50 people have been killed by gunmen during Mass in a Nigerian Catholic church. The country's president has condemned it as a heinous killing of worshippers. But at this stage, it's not yet clear who was behind the attack or what the motive was.
A brazen attack in broad daylight on a packed church in Owo in the southwestern state of Ondo. Local media say attackers fired guns and detonated explosives just as worshippers gathered at St Francis Catholic Church on Pentecost Sunday. Among the dead are many children.
It's quite unbelievable that somebody will come and the intention was to kill everybody in that church.
There are fears the number killed could rise significantly. Medical teams are calling on donations to help those critically injured.
Need blood for them, as many people that are within the hospital environment should come and please assist.
Authorities deny the bishop and priests have been kidnapped, as reports suggest on social media. Although it's not clear who's responsible for the attack, President Muhammadu Buhari says only fiends from the nether region could have conceived and carried out such a dastardly act. The Vatican says Pope Francis is praying for the victims who were painfully stricken in a moment of celebration. While the state is known to be one of the most peaceful in Nigeria, with attacks and kidnappings for ransom by armed gangs occurring mainly in the northwest of the country, there have been increasing violent conflicts between farmers and herders here. The state governor has cut short a trip to the capital to return to Ondo, vowing to commit every available resource to hunt down the assailants and make them pay. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
Well, returning to Indonesia, where President Joko Widodo held talks with the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese today on his second international trip as leader. Southeast Asian politics researcher at ANU, Ross Tapsell, says it's a long-standing tradition for the Australian Prime Minister.
Well, it's now a tradition, I guess, that the Australian Prime Minister first goes to Indonesia for a bilateral meeting. So in a way, it's just maintaining that tradition, and the Indonesian President Joko Widodo appreciated that today. He made a point of saying that Albanese has only been in office for 2 weeks and here he is. But at the same time, the message was quite clear. It was that the government wants to step up in Southeast Asia and do more and be more proactive in the Southeast Asian region and indeed in Indonesia. So there was a message, I think, that the new government was selling, and that was that we want to be a more active partner in Southeast Asia. There was a $200 million commitment to climate and infrastructure funds. And so there's this idea that they are not just turning up for this one-off, traditional meeting in the first 2 weeks and then we're not going to hear from you again. And that's a good sign.
What are the areas, do you think, that need work between the two?
Yeah, so there's a lot of important areas, I think, that sound really great when you say them. And for example, one point made today by the Albanese statement in the palace there in Indonesia was that they wanted to rebuild Indonesian language programs in Australia, for example. That's something that is easy to say. It requires a lot of investment and a lot of government programs to be created. And that's something, of course, education people at universities like me say has been neglected for a very long time. I think, overall, this is better for the country to grow Australia's knowledge and engagement with Indonesia. It makes us a less xenophobic country. It makes us less racist. And there's all these wonderful things that happen when you learn another language. But it's incredibly hard to do. Another example would be climate change, of course. It's great to talk about climate change initiatives and to put in a dollar figure, but this is going to be really hard work, particularly for countries like Indonesia, because obviously there's a whole issue around palm oil, around deforestation that won't be solved overnight. So a lot of the really hard work is going to take time, and it's going to have to be building reliable partnerships between the two countries. And so there's just two quick examples, but there are many that you could really look at. That trade is another one where you could say that it's great to say let's build trade, and Albanese went with a bunch of trade people, but the ease of doing business in Indonesia is a challenge, and it's not going to be easily solved. And so Indonesia needs to reduce bureaucracy for business and for tourists and for travel. And indeed, Australia needs to make it easier for Indonesians to get to Australia around visas and issues like that. So there's actually a hell of a lot of work to do. But so far they're saying the right things.
Yeah. Let's look at the other side, if you will. It would seem under Joko Widodo's presidency, it's been a very internally focused president. Is that necessarily going to change in the remaining years that he's in office?
Yeah, so on the one hand, Joko Widodo is not a man who likes the international stage very much. He doesn't really like these, grand sort of diplomatic engagements. But at the same time, Indonesia more broadly likes to think of itself as a big player on the international stage and an increasingly important player. They're hosting the G20 in November. They're going to be chairing ASEAN next year. So, and there is broad sort of discussions, amongst elites in Indonesia and foreign policy people that they need to be more engaged in the region, the Indo-Pacific. That doesn't mean that they necessarily want to take sides, and Indonesia and Southeast Asian countries are often very quick to say that we don't want to be a pawn in the global power battles between the US and China. But they do think that their voice in negotiating some of the challenges in the Southeast Asian and Asia-Pacific region need to be heard a lot more. And that's something we have to do better at. We have to listen more rather than sort of declare statements about the Indo-Pacific, which Indonesian governments and people may not necessarily agree with.
Yeah, and that's such a good point because, of course, regarding future security in the region, the relationship with China is going to be a difficult one to navigate. Do you think that there could be work done together with Indonesia to assist that?
Yes, and both leaders said that today, that they talked about this issue at a surface level. Indonesia's relationship with China is long and it's complex, and of course there is a long history of migration from China to Indonesia and a long history of Indonesia and Southeast Asia being part of a broader region here. So at the same time, while we've got this challenge of this rising assertive China, we've also got domestic issues that Indonesian presidents and other Southeast Asian leaders have to deal with, which is domestic pressures around China and money and migration. So it's actually a very complex thing, and we can't put countries into boxes around being pro-China or anti-China. And I think the Australian government does understand that, and will have to really continue to understand that as we make these more challenges to be overcome in our region.
Yeah. Ross, you've been monitoring Indonesian media. What's been the response to the election of Anthony Albanese?
Yeah, so, I mean, there have been reports that Anthony Albanese wants to strengthen the relationship, that there's a revitalisation of the relationship. So largely positive. But it is worth saying that overall, the Indonesian media doesn't pay too much attention to Australia. And that's something we should remind ourselves, right? I mean, there's no Indonesian correspondent in Australia to report on the election change. Indonesia tends to largely ignore domestic issues in Australia. So sort of a reminder to all of us, and viewers out there that we have to work harder at being on the radar in a country with, 270 million people that largely looks north and focuses a lot on the Middle East and on, looking more and more at China and less at what's happening down under. So that's the challenge, and that's why it's so important that we maintain these good relationships and see Indonesia as a vital partner for the future.
Yeah, it's not only about Bali, which many Australians seem to think is Indonesia. Good to talk, Ross. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Beth.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says a move by 3 Eastern European countries to block his plane from travelling to Serbia is unprecedented. Bulgaria, North Macedonia and Montenegro closed their airspace to an official plane that would have carried Moscow's top diplomat to Belgrade. The Kremlin has described it as a hostile action.
I know that there will be a lot of explanations which we have not heard yet. Countries which denied passage of the Russian flight will say that they've got an order from EU and NATO. Those will say that countries made the decisions themselves. Anyway, we invited Serbia's foreign minister to visit Moscow shortly. I hope his plane will not be disgracefully sanctioned by shameless Brussels and its clients.
The US and South Korea have launched 8 ballistic missiles into the sea in response to a North Korean weapons test a day earlier. South Korea says the move was aimed at demonstrating the ability to respond swiftly to Pyongyang's attacks. Yesterday, North Korea fired 8 short-range missiles over 35 minutes from at least 4 different locations. It's believed to be a single-day record for the country's ballistic launches. The World Health Organization says there have been 780 confirmed cases of monkeypox in countries where the virus is not usually found. It's roughly triple the 257 reported just a week ago. The WHO says the figure is probably an underestimate and has assessed the global risk level as moderate. The infection is usually mild, but this is the first time it has spread widely outside of Central and West Africa. Well, 6 more people have lost their lives in another deadly day of gun violence in the US with 2 shootings in separate cities. North America correspondent Jade McMillan has more from Washington.
In Philadelphia, hundreds of people were out enjoying a night out in an area packed with bars and restaurants when police say that multiple shooters opened fire. They killed 2 men and a woman and injured 12 others. At this stage, police believe that these shots were fired following an altercation between 2 different groups. They have recovered 2 handguns from the scene but believe that 5 weapons were used and they're still searching for suspects. Meanwhile, at Chattanooga in Tennessee, 3 people were killed and 14 others injured after a shooting near a bar. Police say that 2 people died from gunshot wounds and a 3rd died after being hit by a car while trying to flee. So yet more examples of gun violence in the United States. And while these sorts of mass shootings tend to receive the most media attention, sadly they are an everyday occurrence. Gun violence is an everyday occurrence right right across the country. A bipartisan group of senators has been meeting since that shooting at the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, and we have heard from both sides of those negotiations some optimism today that they might be able to reach agreement on areas like...
Apologies, that has ended abruptly. Alec John Such, the bassist and one of the founding members of the American rock band Bon Jovi, has died at the age of 70. Singer John Bon Jovi announced his death on Twitter, saying Alec was integral to the formation of the band. He was Bon Jovi's bassist from 1983 to 1994 and later rejoined the band for its induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018. Well, Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee celebrations wrapped up with the second surprise appearance by the monarch on the final day of festivities. The 96-year-old royal had only appeared twice during the four-day celebration, but she thrilled fans by emerging on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with the future of the royal family clearly on display. Here's Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins.
The Jubilee Parade had all the pomp and pageantry fit for a queen. Her Majesty appeared as a hologram, waving to the crowds from the 260-year-old state coach that carried her to her coronation in 1953. But the military procession soon took on a street carnival vibe, with displays representing the 7 decades of the Queen's reign. There was plenty of colour and even more cheer. Characters from the super quirky to supermodels. The young royals watched on, a playful Prince Louis, not content to stay in his seat, finally settling for his granddad's knee. But it was the Queen herself who stole the show. After 2 days out of the spotlight due to mobility issues, she was back, flanked by 3 generations of royals, a rock star turnout for a long reigning monarch.
Really quite emotional. My nan brought me to the Golden Jubilee when I was a child, and it was something that always stuck with me, so I wanted to bring my kids along to witness the same thing.
We started to worry a little bit about her health and how she was doing, but the fact that she managed to come out at the end just shows.
The Queen's surprise appearance on the balcony might have buoyed crowds, but her absence throughout the weekend was noticed. This country saw much more of Prince Charles and Prince William, with commentators saying a transition is already underway in the British monarchy. In the royal gardens at Windsor, there was plenty of party spirit.
We will attempt the world's longest loyal toast.
Many here hope to one day see a king in the castle.
I'll be happy for Charles. He's been king in waiting for a very long time, so I'm sure he's ready.
I think it would be rather nice if he did it while the Queen was still alive as well, because then that's his guidance, isn't it?
The Platinum Jubilee will long live in the national memory as the Queen plans for the future of the institution she served for more than 70 years. Isabella Higgins, ABC News, London.
A military reenactment parade has filled the French Normandy town of Sainte-Mère-Église on the eve of the 78th anniversary of D-Day. It was the first French village to be liberated from Nazi occupation. Around 20 World War II veterans took part in the parade, while many history buffs wearing military and civilian clothes also came for the reenactment of events. Thousands of members of Thailand's LGBTQI+ community have raised rainbow flags in the country's first official Pride parade. Also waving blue, pink and white transgender flags, marchers made their way through the main streets of Bangkok, chanting for same-sex marriage to be legalised. 2 bills on LGBTQI+ couples, including one on civil partnerships, are waiting to go before Parliament. Our top stories tonight on the world. British Tory MPs set to vote on whether Boris Johnson should be ousted as leader amid public backlash over parties held at number 10 during COVID lockdowns. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese agrees with President Joko Widodo to strengthen economic and strategic ties during a first state visit to Indonesia. And at least 50 people have been killed and dozens injured after gunmen stormed a Nigerian Catholic church during Mass. Well, let's return to our top story. And Britain's opposition leader has weighed in on the vote of confidence due to be held against the Prime Minister. Keir Starmer says even if Boris Johnson survives this challenge, his leadership will continue to remain in doubt.
I think history tells us that this is the beginning of the end. If you look at the previous examples of no confidence votes, even when Conservative Prime Ministers survive those, and he might survive it tonight, the damage is already done. The boos, I think, reflected a mood across the country. And that's why, amongst other things, I think that's why many Tory MPs feel that that basic trust has gone.
Well, let's return to Indonesia, where the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has met the country's President Joko Widodo. Our Indonesia correspondent Anne Barker says while Mr Albanese's predecessors have reached out to Indonesia in the past, this visit is slightly different.
Prime Minister Albanese wants to show that this Labor government is far more committed to developing stronger ties with Indonesia than any former coalition government. But while Indonesia might be on our doorstep and it's the fourth biggest nation in the world, it's still not even in the top 10 trade partners for Australia. So both countries want to revitalise the trade and investment agreement that was signed just months before the pandemic hit. There's huge potential in that, especially for Australia, to tap a vast market for exports. Indonesia's biggest challenge is its economic recovery after the pandemic hit so hard. It wants Australia to invest in its education sector. It wants Australia to help invest in building new hospitals and health clinics in Java. Both countries also have pledged to work together to tackle climate change, and of course both share concerns about China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea.
A man has died in a tourist bus crash in Central Australia. The crash happened near the remote community of Hermansburg, 125 kilometres southwest of Alice Springs. The incident involving an Emu Run experienced tourist bus was reported at around 4 o'clock this afternoon. There were around 20 people on board. Several are being treated for serious injuries. Well, the global shortage of oil and gas is showing little signs of receding as the price of petrol continues to soar across the world. OPEC has agreed to ramp up production of crude oil over the next 2 months, but countries are scrambling to find alternative supplies in the aftermath of Russian sanctions. Senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, Adi Imsirovic, says OPEC's decision will have a limited impact.
It could have an impact. It's very difficult to say, Beverly, because the increase, what they essentially done, they brought forward the increase they were planning for September into August. The problem's been so far with OPEC that now most of the OPEC countries can't even meet the quotas that they already have. So Russia, for example, is below 1 million barrels of their quota. The only ones that can reach their quota quite easily are Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. But they're not increasing. They're quite happy with higher prices. So really, the jury's out. If the Saudis and the Emiratis decide to increase their output, then it would certainly be very good for the market to calm the market and these high prices and tight demand as well. But if they continue as they have been doing so far, it would pretty much be meaningless.
And so why have some of those other Arab nations not been able to meet their quotas?
Well, it's barely, they just haven't invested enough money. It's the oil market is a little like the sort of Alice in Wonderland's Red Queen. You need to invest a lot of money just to keep running. And with low oil prices in 2014, 2015, I think there was less investment. The United States is another good example. So the investment is needed, and then it's usually a time lag of 2, 3, 4 years before we actually see that output come. And it's coming, but it's coming very slowly.
It is interesting, though, because, as you say, there's that disinvestment, but then there's also this challenge for many nations to seek energy resources and sources elsewhere. So it's hard to know just how much the industry needs to invest.
Well, it's a very, very good question, and you hit the nail on the head there. The problem's been outside OPEC countries. The problem is there's been a lot of government pressure to go to sort of net zero targets, and then the companies sit there and they say, well, you know, if I'm investing in oil, I have to invest money for the next 20 years, and in 20 years there won't be any demand, so I don't really want to invest money. And then some smaller companies also had problems getting the finance because there's been a lot of pressure on banks not to finance, quote, dirty investments. So we are in that sort of difficult situation right now where we still have the demand. The governments have done very little to curb demand. But on the other side, on the supply side, we actually have less supply. So, you know, one of the results of that energy transition is higher prices.
Yeah, it's the perfect storm. And of course, we saw just last week the EU-wide partial embargo on Russian oil. So are they able to really source alternative resources, and what flow-on effect is that going to have?
Well, as far as Europe is concerned, you know, the oil markets are pretty perfect and they work very well. So all that will happen is we'll see higher prices because the Russians will have to go elsewhere, or mainly to Asia, and they'll have to look for other customers like India and China. Europe will probably get oil from the Middle East and West Africa and so on. So the flows, the tankers will meet up in Suez Canal going their own way around. But what will happen is that prices will be higher. The barrels will be sourced, and there'll be a lot more pressure on Russia as a result. I think they'll find it harder and harder to sell their barrels.
So they'll be sitting on oil that has no customer and nowhere to go while the rest of the world struggles.
Well, that's the idea. It's not exactly working at the moment that way yet because India has been buying a lot of barrels, so probably up to 1 million barrels a day of Russian crude. But it is getting harder outside sort of the shores of Malaysia. There are probably 60 million barrels of Russian crude looking for transshipments, and it's becoming extremely expensive and difficult for Russia to move that oil. And we haven't even started what we call secondary sanctions. We've only seen the first wave of sanctions against Russian oil. Europe definitely had to make this decision because it's very hard to tell India, please don't buy Russian oil. If India turns around and says, well, Europe is buying, you know, why wouldn't we buy it? But now that Europe is down to virtually nothing, it'll be much harder to impose secondary sanctions, which is what I expect to be happening in the next 12 months.
Is there anything else that can be done to try and ease this crisis?
To ease the crisis, I think what would probably the best thing for the governments, especially in Europe, would be not to subsidize energy because you need energy demand destruction. By subsidizing demand, we actually just creating even more demand later on and higher prices later. The right policies for the governments would be to let the prices do their work, but then help those who cannot afford with cash payments and help that way. And that would probably be the best policies. But right now, I think we are repeating some of the mistakes we made in 1970s, if you remember, when we had shortages and so on. Subsidies are not a good policy, that's for sure.
Yeah, which is sort of a little bit of what the government did here in a temporary way. Is this going to accelerate, do you feel, the push towards alternative energies? And is there going to be, you know, are we going to be able to pick up that slack quickly enough?
I think it will be, Beverly, because already here in Europe, in the UK, I think roughly half the brand new cars bought are actually electric vehicles. If I was buying a new car, I'd be very reluctant to buy a diesel car. In the short run, it's a little bit frustrating because we see a lot of governments, including some European governments like Germany, moving back to coal. Even UK is thinking of just preserving some coals as a security of supply, sort of for power. But I think that's very, very short term. I think it's very obvious to most of us that we really have to move on and actually not be dependent on all the gentlemen out there that produce the oil, and they're not necessarily the best suppliers and the best for our energy security.
Yeah. And you know, Australia too is looking at severe gas shortages. We've got plentiful gas, but we've sort of made these commitments to customers globally. Is that something that also is flowing on in the international market?
Well, it is. I mean, I think the other problem with Australia is not just commitments. I think the problem is that it's a vast country geographically. So connecting it with pipelines is extremely difficult and expensive, and then you actually need LNG terminals rather than just pipelines. I think Australia is just so lucky. We're a lucky country with so many renewable resources, sun, wind. I see no reasons why Australia shouldn't be putting more money into these renewable resources and actually just reducing their dependence and then selling expensive gas to other people.
Ari, let's hope some of that starts moving fairly quickly. Good to talk as always. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Heavy thunderstorms have brought hail and flooding to parts of southern and western Germany. Some roads have been blocked with hailstones piled up to half a metre high. Officials have warned more thunderstorms are set to move through the country, travelling from the southwest to the northeast. The former New South Wales Deputy Premier has been awarded $715,000 in a defamation case against Google. John Barilaro sued the tech giant over 2 YouTube videos created by the comedian known as Friendly Geordies.
For more than a year before bowing out of politics, John Barilaro was the subject of a campaign on the second most visited site in the world.
I'm happy it's the end of the journey.
2 videos published in late 2020 by Jordan Shanks, aka Friendly Geordies, were found to have unfairly portrayed Mr Barilaro as a corrupt conman, among other imputations. Today, a judge said the campaign was relentless, racist, vilificatory, abusive and defamatory. Last year, the retired politician settled against Mr Shanks after the comedian apologised and edited some of the videos. The judge today said Google couldn't escape liability. He needed YouTube to disseminate his poison. Google was willing to join Mr Shanks in doing so to earn revenue as part of its business model. He awarded $715,000 in damages.
It was never about money, it was about an apology, removal.
The judge took aim at another video published in December last year, which he said attacked the professional integrity of Mr Barilaro's lawyers without basis. The judge referred the conduct of Jordan Shanks and Google to the principal registrar to consider proceedings against each. He said there appeared to be serious contempts of court by bringing improper pressure to bear on Mr Barilaro and his lawyers not to pursue the defamation case. In a statement, Mr Shanks said Mr Barilaro's claim of parliamentary privilege prevented evidence being used against him. Poor old Google left to carry the can. I guess they are rich enough to not care. The ex-politician says he's now enjoying private life. Jamie McKinnell, ABC News, Sydney.
Millions of workers in the gig economy and casuals are hopeful the Albanese government will bring more stable employment. Labor has an ambitious industrial relations reform agenda, but some businesses are already warning the government's plans won't work.
It's not a good time to be employed through an app or on contract after contract.
Fuel prices and all the living costs comes up.
It's stressful. It's a juggle. It's a juggle with time, it's a juggle with money and the budget.
The new government has promised substantial changes to work laws.
They're potentially massive. We're talking about everything from security of employment right through to the gender pay gap.
Labor has promised to enshrine secure work and gender pay equity in workplace laws, to legislate a cap on rolling contracts and set a minimum pay level for gig economy workers such as delivery drivers.
That will just keep us safe, secure.
Those who operate online platforms say the gig economy is different.
Mabel is not setting the terms of those engagements. We're not establishing rates. It's the small businesses engaging directly with their clients.
Business groups don't see a problem.
Job security has arguably never been better. We have an unemployment rate of 3.9%. We have employment growing.
Hi, Farida.
For years, Janine worked as a contractor or temp, without holidays, sick pay or superannuation.
You're usually going from paycheck to paycheck, so planning is just keeping a roof over your head. It's really the basics.
Now in a secure role, she hopes others will get the same stability.
Housing, education, future prospects. They'd just be able to live a more secure life.
The new government has proposed a jobs summit in September, but first it has to make its case for the minimum wage to be raised to match soaring inflation. Daniel Ziffer, ABC News.
New COVID cases in WA have fallen to their lowest level in nearly 3 months, with the state reporting fewer than 5,000 new infections today. But while the state's Omicron wave fades, the impact of the pandemic in Perth CBD is still hitting some businesses significantly. A month after mask mandates were relaxed amid suggestions face coverings were keeping people out of offices, new data shows the number of people in the city has increased but remains well below pre-COVID levels.
Not everything is as it seems at Nancy Feng's Perth Cafe, including her usual customers.
To be honest, we don't really focus on the business people here.
Even though she's at the base of a 12-storey office building, she's used social media and some unique offerings to entice customers in.
Especially with our desserts as well, you probably can't see anywhere in Perth. So everything here is unique.
It means she hasn't missed CBD workers who've chosen to work at home, particularly when masks were mandatory. But on the opposite side of the terrace, Anthony Arnold's had a different view from behind his coffee machine.
It's still probably about 50% away to a third away from where it was beforehand, but definitely noticing, a difference week to week.
Data gathered by tech giant Google shows since the start of the year, the number of people working from city offices has been trending down. It picked up slightly after mask mandates were lifted, but is still below pre-pandemic levels.
I think you'll probably see the closure of a lot of venues, particularly. You've already seen a lot disappear.
And with some of WA's largest employers sticking with flexible work policies, the number of office workers in the CBD may never fully recover, leading to a raft of changes.
There'll probably be open desk offices and probably a smaller floor area than they would have needed with all their staff there.
That might make things tough for CBD retail and hospitality in the short term, but increasing numbers of apartments could change that.
At the moment you are serving the working population between 9 and 5, and you're closed overnight and over the weekends. Whereas if you get more residents within the CBD, then you have that after-hours business as well.
In the short term, the government's hoping it can entice people back with money for events by revitalising Yagan Square. But any significant change will take some time, leaving a difficult road ahead for many CBD businesses. Keegan Burke, ABC News.
Rafael Nadal has won his 14th French Open tennis championship over Norway's Casper Ruud. The 36-year-old now has 2 more Grand Slam victories than his greatest rivals, Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer. But Nadal has revealed he had to play with numbing injections to overcome a chronic condition in his foot that could end his stellar career. Here's national sports reporter David Mark.
He's done it again. It's a historic 14th Roland Garros title for Nadal.
Every win for Rafael Nadal is creating new records, but this French Open might be the most precious of all his 22 Grand Slams.
Means a lot to me, means everything.
His opponent, Casper Ruud, tried.
Oh, yeah.
But the man who once trained at Nadal's own academy could do little to stop the onslaught, losing 6-3, 6-3, 6-love.
Too good.
I got to feel how it is to play against you in the final, and it's not easy, and I'm not the first victim.
Nadal was playing his own body as much as Ruud, revealing after the match he had injections in his left foot to blunt the pain from a chronic bone condition.
I have no feelings on my foot. My doctor was able to put anesthetic injections on the nerves.
But he's not prepared to do it again, even if it means missing Wimbledon.
If I am able to play with anti-inflammatories, yes. To play with anesthetic injections, no.
He plans to try to burn 2 nerves in his foot, and if that doesn't work, he says he may consider surgery as a final option.
I don't know what can happen in the future, but I'm gonna keep fighting to try to keep going, so many thanks.
At 36, and with a body crying out for him to stop, this may have been Rafael Nadal's last farewell. But if so, he was on the court that allowed him to become, numerically at least, the greatest in history.
I hope, we all hope that you will continue for some more time.
All tennis fans are hoping the same. David Mark, ABC News.
What a champion. Australian Minjee Lee has won the biggest prize in women's golf, taking out the US Open at Pine Needles by 4 shots. She claimed her second major and picked up $2.5 million, which is the highest prize money in the history of the women's game.
What a champion.
Walking up the 18th fairway, Minjee Lee was living a scenario she'd acted out as a young girl on golf courses in Western Australia.
I for sure have done it. This is to win the US Open, like for a little 5-footer.
She just ran away from everybody. Minjee Lee.
The 26-year-old joins her mentor, Kari Webb, and Jan Stevenson as the only Australians to win the tournament.
It's such a great honour just to be amongst those two names.
Her younger brother, fellow golf professional Min Woo Lee, was brought to tears, and he won't be the only one inspired by the triumph.
I think this will be huge for all the little girls and even the boys and the children watching.
Lee started her final round with a 3-shot lead over American Mina Haragai and adopted an aggressive approach to extend the advantage.
Rolls in a long birdie putt.
On the 12th hole, the Perth-born player had one hand on the trophy.
Oh, it's a clinic. Wonderful.
Her coach believes Lee deserves a higher profile.
She's now a 2-time major winner. In any other sport, it'd probably be very well known.
Smith says the Women's US Open has set the standard by nearly doubling its total prize money.
There's still 4 majors that are well behind in terms of funding. What we need to realise is that the women work just as hard as the men.
While the winner's cheque will be welcomed, it was the trophy Lee was after.
This is pretty special. This is the one that I've always wanted to win since I was a little kid.
Lee moves to number 2 in the rankings while feeling on top of the world. Duncan Huntsdale, ABC News.
In just over 48 hours, the Maroons will look to do something they haven't done in 5 years, beat the Blues in Sydney. The side has just touched down in the harbour city, ready to launch a new Queensland era with a big upset.
Touching down in enemy territory with one goal in mind, deliver a blow to the Blues in their Sydney homecoming. Fans are hard to come by across the border.
Obviously you enjoy every part of what the camp brings and what Origin brings, but the ultimate moment is when you run out and you get to play. That's the best part.
The game plan has been plotted and trained. Now all that's left to do is execute.
Billy and his staff have definitely put, their spin on it, what they believe is going to help us play well on Wednesday night, and everyone's really bought into that style of footy.
A style of footy which Cherry Evans is confident brings out the best of his Maroons side, which includes determined forwards, naturally gifted backs, and a playmaker who's dangerous but a larrikin.
Cameron Munster probably needs a kick up the arse every now and then, and Billy gives him that when he needs one, but that's what makes camp so energetic and so enjoyable to be around in camp.
Right on cue, mid-press conference.
Every game. See? That's what I'm talking about. He's still the same idiot that we all love.
In Sydney now, but the Maroons hope when they come to Brisbane for Game 3, they've either wrapped the series up or are playing in a decider.
But honestly, it's all about just going out there and coming together, playing good footy.
It's a sentiment which will be echoed by Queensland's women's side, unveiled today, the 22-woman squad headlined by 40-year-old Titans forward Steph Hancock.
She bleeds maroon and you can see that when she's training and her efforts that she puts in.
The clash in Canberra on Friday, June 24, will be the last one-off Women's Origin match between the states.
Currently we're sitting on 2 games for next year and pushing for it to go to 3 the year after that.
Jessica Stewart, ABC News.
In one of the biggest blunders seen in MotoGP, Spanish rider Aleix Espargaro has missed out on a podium finish at the Catalonia Grand Prix after thinking the race was over a lap before it had actually ended. The Spaniard lifted off the throttle and started to wave to fans in celebration at the Barcelona-Catalunya circuit when he crossed the line on the second-last lap. Espargaro was in second place at the time, behind eventual winner Fabio Quartararo.
What a howler by Aleix Espargaro! We thought it was a mechanical. He thought the race was over. He's made an incredible miscalculation.
The 32-year-old realised his mistake a few turns later, as you can see. Immediately went back to race and eventually finishing in 5th spot. Let's get a check of the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
A chilly southwesterly wind and a few showers each day this week in the southeast, thanks to the high that's barely moving. And embedded cold fronts will continue to move up as well. In the west, it'll be mostly dry until later on Wednesday when that low pressure system and some troughs move closer to the coast, and then it'll be wet along the west coast right through into the weekend. A few showers in North Queensland with onshore winds, and showers especially along the coast tomorrow between Cairns and Mackay, and the tablelands south of Mareeba, partly cloudy in Brisbane. In New South Wales, showers about the ranges and western slopes spreading across the southern inland. Snow on the southern Alps lowering to 700 metres by the evening. Mostly clear elsewhere, including Sydney. In Canberra, a shower or two. Showers in Victoria will ease inland during the afternoon. They will fall as snow above 700 metres. And in Tasmania, snow down to 300 metres from the afternoon. Showers mostly in the west, south, central areas and Bass Strait Islands and in Hobart. Showers over South Australia's agricultural areas in the far south of the Flinders district. In Adelaide, showers mostly falling in the morning. Most of Western Australia will be in the clear, but maybe a shower over the Gascoyne, far west Pilbara coasts and near the south coast east of Walpole. In Perth, mostly sunny. And to the Territory, showers and thunderstorms across the northeast Arnhem district and the northeast Gove Peninsula, but Darwin, though, mostly sunny.
Our top stories tonight. British Tory MP set to vote on Boris Johnson's leadership following backlash over illegal parties held at Downing Street during lockdowns. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has met with President Joko Widodo to strengthen relations during his first state visit to Indonesia. And at least 50 people have been killed after gunmen stormed a Nigerian Catholic church during Mass. That is your world for this Monday. You can watch the show on iView, and there are more news and interviews at the YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. I'll see you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.
Tomorrow on News Breakfast, a big day for home buyers. We'll look ahead to the Reserve Bank's crucial interest rate decision and ask how high will they go.
And one of the future stars of basketball will meet the 17-year-old from Sydney who's just been selected for the NBA's Global Academy.
Look, it's a flashy gimmick to market the new season of Growin'.
This is genius. Great advertising.
Featuring your favourite advertising experts.
Collect us all.
Fully customisable to fit your personality. And they'll sing your favourite advertising jingles.
No, we won't, but we will deconstruct the way that brands are trying to sell to you.
It's the new and improved Growin'.
It's the same show as ever. Now let me out of here.
Growin', available Wednesday at the new time of 8 p.m. Free delivery via ABC TV and ABC iView. Battery sold separately.
Have you tried Freeview? Discover all the amazing content across free-to-air TV in one easy place. We've got over 50,000 episodes, more than 30 channels to choose from. 100% free. Visit freeview.com.au.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
What is in this Constitution and how will it benefit us?
It'll be my job to bring people together.
I do really believe there is a deep reservoir of goodwill, and I think that transcends left or right.
Coming up, Virginia Trioli looks at the future of the arts sector with Tony Burke, Darren Hayes, Adam Liao and Katie Noonan, who will also perform live.
Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Some people search for it, others hide from it, from household names to people who have found themselves in the spotlight. Join me, Courtney Act, on 1+1 as I speak to well-known Australians about what fame means to them.
1+1 with Courtney Act, Thursday 9:35 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
India, a powerhouse of culture, politics, diversity. And it's time to take a close-up look.
I'm Mark Fennell. Join me and a panel of guests every Monday night for a new show, India Now.
We'll bring you the key issues and latest news from the subcontinent, exploring everything that makes India and its neighbours the region to watch. We've got more than 1.8 billion stories to tell. India Now, Monday nights on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Journey to another world as ABC Classic brings you the Classic 100 Music for the Screen. From Game of Thrones to The Crown, From Mario Brothers to Final Fantasy, from Jaws to Star Wars. Celebrate your favourite music from film, television and gaming with Australia's biggest weekend of classical music. The Classic 100 Music for the Screen. This weekend on ABC Classic and ABC Listen.
Join innovators and trailblazers.
How about this for our first date?
For one final trip down memory lane.
I started choreographing my first work here. Wow.
This is like where I grew up.
God, it hasn't changed.
Plus, the most emotional homecoming yet.
What a privilege to be part of this.
In Julius Amiro's very own home delivery.
Oh my goodness. I would have loved to walk through here with him.
Starts Sunday, June 19 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
I'm hoping when we'll turn 90, we're going to be together like we are now.
Can I say something? She's really going to be sexy when she turns 90.
I'm Sarika.
I'm Varun.
We are 39 years young.
Happy birthday, ABC.
In India, we say, Janam Din Mubarak Ho.
Hello, Von Yong with top stories on ABC News. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is due to face the biggest test of his leadership when his party holds a confidence vote. The Conservative Party leader has resisted calls from dozens of Tory politicians to resign over a series of parties held at Downing Street during a strict COVID lockdown. At least 54 MPs have written letters to trigger the ballot. The result will be known tomorrow morning Australian time. If Mr Johnson survives the vote, he won't face another challenge for a year. Anthony Albanese will go to the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali later this year, despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's possible attendance. The Prime Minister made the promise during his first state visit to Indonesia. After being welcomed at Bogor Palace, Mr Albanese and President Joko Widodo agreed to strengthen economic and strategic ties. And Northern Territory police say a person has died in a tour bus crash west of Alice Springs, 5 kilometres east of the remote community of Hermannsburg. The bus belongs to tourist operator Emu Run Experience and was believed to be carrying at least 20 people. Some have been taken to Alice Springs Hospital, while others are being treated in a local clinic. Those are the latest stories. I'm Yvonne Yong.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Bridget Brennan. Coming up, the Prime Minister seeks to reboot Australia's relationship with Indonesia as high-level talks begin in Jakarta. Public sector workers in New South Wales set to receive a 3% pay rise and new measures announced for healthcare workers. And what happens when Plato meets playtime? We speak with one philosopher answering the questions that confound children and adults alike. And joining me on the panel tonight, biomedical scientist Dr Darren Saunders is here. In Melbourne, international relations consultant and former Liberal pre-selection candidate Erin Watson-Lynn. Foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. And in Perth, law graduate and founder of Modest Fashion Australia, Aisha Novakovic. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. Well, all New South Wales public sector workers are set to receive a 3% boost to their base pay, breaking a decade-long pay rise cap of 2.5%. The Premier Dominic Perrottet announced the decision today, along with a bonus to thank frontline healthcare workers for their hard work during the pandemic. The decision comes as more than 300,000 workers faced a cost of living crisis, but the pay increase falls short of inflation, meaning many of those workers will continue to go backwards. Here's the Drum's David Taylor.
Making ends meet, paying for petrol, rent, the weekly shopping. It's causing stress for millions of households. One solution, of course, is higher pay for workers, and state and territory governments have some sway here.
Today we're announcing the biggest boost.
New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet has announced every public sector worker across the state will get a 3% pay rise. That breaks the current pay growth cap of 2.5%, introduced in 2011. It means, for example, the base salary of a registered nurse in their 4th year of service rises from $76,666 to $78,605. In part, it's a response to increased industrial disputes. The government has been locked in protracted negotiations with the rail, tram and bus union for more than a year. While nurses, teachers, paramedics and bus drivers have also taken industrial action in recent months.
We believe today that the wage policy that we're announcing is fair and responsible. It understands the competing interests of the budget.
Workers have also been promised up to 3.5% pay increase next financial year if the government sees evidence public servants are working harder or improving productivity.
Productivity has outstripped wages growth at double the pace since 1975. So I think Australian workers have well demonstrated that they're productive. There's no point waiting for more productivity gains because they won't naturally flow onto wages.
How is it the case?
It continues to be hard going for public sector workers in other states and territories too. At 3%, New South Wales has the highest pay rise cap.
There's a signal that these governments are sending to all the private sector about what the going rate is for skills and, and contributions and passion and time of people, and the private sector follows suit.
Now, private sector profits are booming, but workers' share of those profits are at a record low. So there are calls to overhaul the wage determination system to help struggling household budgets. Public sector coffers, on the other hand, are deeply in the red, limiting the capacity of governments to improve worker pay. And there really doesn't seem to be much improvement on the horizon.
Government has to step into the void, and that is everything to do about paying its own public sector workers properly.
But the latest information from both the government national accounts and the Reserve Bank's business surveys suggest pay rises are growing in size, and it's fueling inflation, which needs to be contained. So renters and mortgage borrowers alike are bracing for another interest rate hike from the Reserve Bank tomorrow, and more later this year.
David Taylor reporting there. And for more on this, we're joined by Radiology Registrar and Co-Chair of the New South Wales AMA's Doctors in Training Committee, Dr Sanjay Hatish. Sanjay, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me here.
Look, much of the announcement today, what the Premier was talking about was healthcare. Can you just give us a picture, because we've heard so many systems in New South Wales but also across the country are in crisis. What does that mean for people working on the wards?
Look, I think the first thing to understand is that before COVID, I think the healthcare system was already under strain. So I think doctors in training in particular were working in conditions where they were dealing with more patients with either the same or less resources. COVID's just compounded that. So we've had situations where now doctors in training have been asked to delay their training, education requirements they have to continue on in their specialist training, and at the same time they've had to cover colleagues that are taking leave because they've got COVID or close contacts, as well as other things. So I think that's just compounded things that are already happening in the healthcare system, and it's led to very high rates of burnout. And I think that's the kind of sort of system that these changes are sort of looking to help. Yeah.
And the Premier said that the state will try to recruit 10,000 more healthcare workers. But how tricky will that be when people hear that this is a profession where burnout and overwork is a huge problem? I mean, are people going to be attracted to those jobs?
Yeah, no, really good question. I think, look, the 10,000 was, great to hear that number. That's a big number. We like to hear big numbers. But it was interesting to see, what's the split going to be. And it's also interesting to hear about that it was about providing staff for these new hospitals and new developments they've got, which I think is great. Obviously great to think about staffing the hospitals that you're going to build. But I think the other problem is that there are already problems with the facilities they already have. So they, the staffing levels in those facilities are already under strain as well. So I wonder how that's going to help in that scenario. And you're right, the other unfortunate thing, if you go to any hospital in New South Wales at the later part of the year, they'll be looking for junior doctors to fill in quite a few gaps. Reasons for that is because, they're quite hard places to work. And if doctors in training can go to another state where they've got better remuneration and better award conditions, they will. And also locum work as well, where they feel they get paid and actually valued in that level of pay for the work that they do. So yeah, it's going to be quite tricky for the government to deal with that, even though announcing this, but actually, yeah, will there be people there to actually fill the spots?
And just talk to us about the real-world consequences of working under huge levels of stress and when you're absolutely exhausted, because you've done a survey that looks at what kind of errors people make when they're working under these conditions.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. We did the hospital health check survey across New South Wales hospitals, and basically that showed that levels of fatigue and stress amongst my colleagues were very high. And what we also saw is that, up to 40% of my colleagues fear that they could make a mistake just because of their fatigue level, so clinical error. And, that's really concerning. I think we all go to work wanting to do the best for our patients. We want to provide the best healthcare we can to the residents of New South Wales. And when you're in conditions, and I'm not talking about fatigue where, I think everyone's got fatigue, long days at work. I'm talking about where colleagues are working 12 to 16 hours a day. They have to do ongoing unrostered overtime because just to cover for other colleagues. And when you've got those kind of conditions, there's only so much cognitively you can deal with. And in those kind of areas, you then end up, fearing that you could, have a miss or, cause an issue with patient care. So that survey is, the good thing about it is that we've been able to talk with the New South Wales Health and the government as well as hospitals to try and slowly get some improvements in terms of the well-being of our of doctors in training, but there's a long way to go.
Darren, we have a view of healthcare workers, well, it's typically true that they're empathetic, caring people who go into the profession for a reason. Is there an assumption that because they care about their job and their patients that they can put up with slower pay growth, do you think?
Yeah, I think there is. I think it's partially a exploitative mindset that, well, these people are going to turn up for work anyway. They're typically very highly motivated. I know from my students and colleagues that are clinical workers, incredibly highly motivated. And I don't think a lot of people actually realise just how tough the conditions are that particularly training doctors are placed under, the hours that are expected of them. And there really is a mental health crisis playing out in our health workforce at the moment. While compensation isn't everything, it's about conditions and it's about, short-term rosters and all that sort of stuff. There's no doubt that to be adequately compensated for that is an important part of it. So I think in some respects we're kind of taking advantage of the fact that a lot of those people will keep doing the job regardless of the conditions.
Erin, I want to get your thoughts. 10,000 new workers, I mean, as Sanjay said, good to have a target, but where do they come from? And if it's we're recruiting from overseas, how do we adequately train and support these new workers into the system?
Yeah, all terrific questions. So my partner's actually just finished his specialty training in cardiology, and obviously I sit on the policy side of things, and we talk about the, that intersection between things like these sorts of policy announcements and what actually that means in the, in medicine and other fields as well, not just healthcare. And 10,000 is great. What a fantastic addition to the system. But the reality is that you can't train an ICU doctor overnight. You can't train a cardiologist overnight or anyone in any of these specialties. It takes a lot of time. So obviously one of those options is bringing people in from overseas, but at the moment we don't have the skills recognition. It's not optimised. It's not for example, I was just with some colleagues from India over the weekend, and if we had better healthcare skills recognition from India to Australia, we could be recruiting healthcare workers from India and attracting them into the Australian labour market and healthcare workforce. So that's a real opportunity that we've got right now in terms of strengthening our relationship with India as well, is saying if you've got really high trained, really clever, really competent healthcare workers, which they do, and if we can train them and bring them to Australia, that's a really significant opportunity. But unless we're doing that, unless we're able to have those skills transfers internationally, we'll say we'll have 10,000 new doctors or 10,000 new healthcare workers, and we can't produce them overnight. It's just as simple as that.
Greg, what New South Wales is offering is a little bit more generous than other states and territories, but it is still below inflation, meaning a lot of these workers will be still struggling to make ends meet at the end of the day. Should it be higher?
Well, look, I think it's a reasonable decision. We are living a very long way beyond our means. So the healthcare workers in this country are brilliant. I've had my bouts in hospital and they're just fantastic. You couldn't find better in the world. But we're facing $1.2 trillion of federal government debt. When you add state government debt as well, we're indebted in the public sector well over $2 trillion. And in the end, we're going to have to pay that debt off. Interest rates are going to go up, and we're going to end up like the 1970s, where one of the biggest items of government expenditure every year is just paying interest on our debt. You don't want inflation to get entrenched, and if you immediately match every inflationary jump with a wage jump, you do get entrenched inflation, and ultimately that leads to unemployment. It also is tremendously disadvantageous to the people on fixed incomes and low incomes. So then you've got to increase their transfer payments, and you can end up chasing your tail. Generally, maybe not in the health sector, but generally public sector workers are very well paid in Australia by international standards. And I like the $3,000 special payment because it's not baked into the budget, but $3,000 is enough for people to notice. But these things are always a compromise. I mean, of course, health workers deserve more. So do policemen, so do soldiers, so do almost everyone I know, except maybe all of us on this panel. We could all take a pay cut, but everyone else deserves more, but there's only so much to go around.
Well, Aisha, we're all armchair economists now, some of us better than others. But, you know, what some people have been saying, as Greg touched on, that if wages rise too quickly, there's a spike in inflation.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, but is that fair on public sector workers who've been arguing for a pay rise for a long while?
Well, I don't mean to be deliberately controversial, but I think that this is an example of the failure of trickle-down economics, and I think the fact that we're having this conversation about a mere 3% increase, it doesn't even keep up with hyperinflation in this country, shows that we're all just fighting over the scraps. I mean, I live here in WA, which is a mining state, and there's trillions of dollars of output. I mean, on paper, we shouldn't have a health system in crisis. We should have more resources poured into things like mental health. We should have the best infrastructure in the world, and so on and so forth. And yet, where are those trillions of dollars going? We're actually in debt. I think the paradigm for the way we manage our economics and the fact that we are still complicit in allowing the top 1% of this country to line their pockets, and these are mainly individual families, and in actual fact those minerals in the earth belong to all of us in principle, and we are not getting what we rightly deserve.
Sanjay, what the Premier said today was that there could be a further slight increase to pay, 0.5%. Let me read this because it's a bit complex. Next year for employees that make a substantial contribution to productivity enhancing reforms, and not much more detail than that. What exactly is a productivity enhancing reform, do you think?
Good, nice sort of little string of buzzwords there that I thought. No, that's a really good question. I think, look, it was only announced today, so I think AMA New South Wales is going to go back and ask more about exactly what it means. But if it means increasing productivity, as I think someone said before, the fact of the matter is that the healthcare system, doctors in training, nurses, allied health, we're dealing with more and more patients with the same resources. I feel that's increasing productivity. So hopefully that's what the Premier means, and we can all get this little dividend, efficiency dividend.
Hopefully it doesn't mean 18 hours rather than 16 hours a day. Well, Darren, in the last year, I mean, if you haven't been in New South Wales, you might have missed it. I've certainly missed it living in Victoria. But here in New South Wales, there's been waves of industrial action across a lot of different sectors. Yep. How much do you think that has influenced today's decision? Has it put the pressure on the government to listen?
I think what we're seeing today is definitely a response partly to that industrial action, and it has been across, teachers, train drivers, bus drivers. I mean, it's important to point out the New South Wales government is, I think, still Australia's largest employer by quite a significant margin, and so they set the tone more broadly. And so if they're hearing the message, but they're still not responding in the way that a lot of people would like. I mean, even a 3% increase is still leaving people going backwards in real terms. I mean, I think it shows that they're possibly trying to walk a tightrope between appearing to respond without blowing the budget, as Greg was talking about. I'm not sure that it will necessarily cut it, because I don't think it's just about wages. A lot of the industrial action, particularly from teachers and bus drivers and train drivers, is around other issues other than just wages and working conditions and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how much that actually does put a lid on that industrial action.
Everyone's completely stressed out after 2 years of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Well, Sanjay, I mean, sadly, we've heard of really eminent doctors and also a young cohort of doctors leaving the system. Has that ever crossed your mind? I mean, have you ever thought, I'll just give this up, it's just too much?
Yeah, look, luckily I'm, well, in terms of leaving New South Wales, you know, sort of entrenched here. So, but in terms of leaving healthcare, yes, it has crossed my mind. I think, you know, as been said, I think it's not all about wages, it's about our working conditions as well. And I think if you ask any doctor in training if they'd rather have $3,000 up front or they'd have better fatigue provisions, they'd have better leave provisions, being able to get some sort of personal development allowance to actually go towards their study, which, you know, helps the state, helps the patients of New South Wales. They'd take those award conditions any day. So, look, it definitely has crossed my mind, but at the end of the day, you know, I do love my job and I love, love working for New South Wales Health, but it'd just be nice if it'd be a bit easier on occasion.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your insights. That's Dr. Sanjay Hatij. He's the co-chair of the New South Wales AMA Doctors in Training Committee. At last month's federal election, Western Australia was fertile ground for the Labor Party, where a massive statewide swing helped see the party to victory. And now Anthony Albanese has thanked West Australians for their support during his first trip to the state since becoming Prime Minister. On the brief trip, the PM had dinner with Labor Premier Mark McGowan and met with volunteers and MPs at Kings Park, where he promised increased visits to the West.
I made a commitment as leader of the Labor Party that I would come to Western Australia 10 times a year, and I repeat that commitment as Prime Minister, that I will endeavour to be a regular visitor here, not just someone who drops in when there's an election campaign, but spends time here, because I want to be the Prime Minister for the entire country.
Aisha, let's go to you. You're in the West. Do West Australians feel like they've been forgotten? Is that why we hear about Wexit and other things?
Oh, Wexit. Oh my gosh, another reason for us to just claim all the resources for ourselves and not share with the rest of the nation. And I think that for a very long time, I mean, I certainly have felt like when I've flown over to Canberra or the eastern states, it's like treated like a weirdo. Oh my gosh, you've come all the way from WA, you have flown 5 hours. And I'm like, yes, I know it's actually closer for me to fly to Bali. This is true. Today is actually a public holiday. It's all about celebrating WA. It's called WA Day. So that is meant to really be an inclusive day to celebrate Aboriginal heritage and be very inclusive of all people in this state. But I mean, it's a nice pledge from the PM and it is a refreshing change. After all, I think it was WA that really gave the Labor government its majority win for Parliament. So it's almost like we're being rewarded, which is nice.
Erin, you're from the West. What does Anthony Albanese and the Labor government need to do to reward West Australians over their next term?
Well, I'd like to make 2 points. So the first point is that actually it was Mark McGowan who won Western Australia for Anthony Albanese. It wasn't the other way around. Mark McGowan, you know, he really did make Western Australians feel safe during the pandemic. And despite all of us over here on the East Coast whining about not getting in through the borders, you know, everyone I speak to felt like that the Premier had stood by them. But number two is that it's actually not so much about Anthony Albanese, but it's actually about Mark McGowan. So to go back to that point that was made earlier about trickle-down economics, well, here you have a Premier posting a $6 billion surplus of taxpayers' money, and yet you cannot get into the hospital system. That is Western Australians' money, and it should be reinvested back into the healthcare system, particularly if you call yourself a Labor government. So I think that Western Australians should really, and that's my family and my friends, look at itself and go, well, why aren't we getting the services that we're paying for with our taxes? Why are we posting such an enormous surplus? And if Anthony Albanese can do anything, perhaps it's maybe work with Mark McGowan to understand how that government money, that taxpayers' money, our money, should be spent. I'm really looking forward to going home next month and spending time again with my family after being locked out of the state for 2 years. I've seen them once over there in 2 years. So I'm looking forward to going back and enjoying all the wonderful things that WA really has to offer.
Aisha, what would you like to see, and what are you hearing from people that you know that would like from the, what would you like from the federal government?
I definitely agree with the fact that it's Mark McGowan's popularity which really helped to build that trust in a Labor government. I think moving forward, I really would like to see results beyond the rhetoric. I know we're in the honeymoon phase and it can be very tempting to jump up and down, but I would like to wait to see long term what the results will be. I prefer to be a student of history and of the long game rather than being, I suppose, under an illusion that things will radically shift. I definitely agree with the fact that with such a big surplus, we really should be seeing much more of an impact in our health and social services. So that's why I'm saying, as much as we can all celebrate, let's see what the real work produces.
Very early into this government's term. Well, Darren, while Mr Albanese was speaking in Perth, he said it a few times over the past couple of weeks, he wants to reset the tone, and he had another dig at the former Morrison government, saying the briefings he's received seem to show that that government was quite focused on politics. But this is also about optics, isn't it? This promise of 10 visits a year and a closer relationship?
Yeah, it's very much about optics. And Aisha's right. I think we're right to encourage the rhetoric, but wait to see what the results actually are. And I think something that we really saw in COVID was a real fracturing of the federation. You know, there was all this sort of argy-bargy between the states and between the states and the federal government. So I think it's right for the Prime Minister to try and use the election of his new government to sort of reset that rhetoric, if you like. And there's certainly nothing wrong with trying to sort of mend relationships between the states and try to make Australia feel like a more cohesive nation again, because I think we probably started to fray around the edges a little bit, particularly with Western Australia and the sort of isolationist sort of situation that they're in over there. So I think it's encouraging, but yeah, let's wait and see how it actually plays out.
Greg, the Prime Minister's promised 10 visits a year and a couple of cabinet meetings. Is that a symbolic gesture, do you think?
Well, I think it's a very good move indeed. I think it's a terrific move. I mean, we are a big, broad country. You know, West Australia once voted for secession. The federal government simply ignored it altogether. Perth is the largest city to be as isolated from another city of its own size on the planet. And, you know, nobody likes to say a good word for Tony Abbott, but he took 2 federal cabinet meetings to remote Aboriginal communities. And we're sort of locked into a quadrangle of Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, and with an occasional look in for Brisbane. And we're a much bigger, wider country than that. I don't even like the language of the Prime Minister visited Perth. You don't visit your home country, really. You're just in Perth. It costs a bit of money and it takes a travel budget, and you've got to arrange accommodation and public servants and so on. But I think the Cabinet should routinely meet in places other than Canberra. And, you know, Western Australia is a very distinctive part of Australia. It has an economy unlike any other, even not like Queensland. And I want to see the federal cabinet in Queensland, in Western Australia, and South Australia. They ought to go to Tasmania too. They won a lot of seats in Western Australia. They didn't win many in Tasmania. They ought to go there too. They're Australians. They ought to go to remote communities, remote Aboriginal communities. You know, being in the cabinet, you're meant to work hard. A lot of Australians have that 5-hour plane journey, and our federal politicians should be among them.
So you would support the Cabinet going, say, to regional centres, not just our capital cities, but choosing some different places to hear from people on the ground?
Absolutely. It's a paradox of Australia that we used to be more decentralised at the time of federation in 1901 than we are now. So you had big formative meetings that led to federation in Ballarat and Parkes and all kinds of places. You know, I was in Toowoomba last week. What a wonderful place Toowoomba is. It's fantastic. I think, I can't imagine the last time there's been a federal cabinet meeting there. Now, it all requires quite a little bit of trouble. It's not amenable to public servants in Canberra. There are logistical problems and security and communications, but that is part of being Australia. And I certainly want remote Aboriginal communities to see federal ministers. There's nothing like being there physically. It's quite different from just having a phone conversation. And so I think, you know, Albo is going to suffer because I praise him so often, but I think this is a really good move from the new government.
We'll see what you're saying in a couple of months, Greg. Well, Erin, I think there's one seat in wider Perth still left in Liberal hands. Has Labor completely rewritten the electoral map in WA?
Well, it's quite interesting because the lower house seat that I think you're thinking of is Canning, which is where my parents live, actually, where Andrew Hastie is the local member. And if you look back, that was actually quite a marginal seat when he won that pre-selection, actually, when the previous member unfortunately had passed away, and he stepped into that role. And he has, like, I actually haven't looked at the final numbers, and perhaps I should have before I came in, but he's sitting on like 15%. That is such a safe seat now. And, you know, it's an interesting demographic. It's quite a big area, but it's a much older population. There's parts of Canning that are quite wealthy, full of baby boomer retirees that everybody hates because they all own lots of real estate, self-funded retirees. And then you've got the total other end of the spectrum as well. So then if you look at the state seats within his electorate, it's a little bit more diverse in terms of which way they vote. Well, I mean, obviously they're all Labor at the moment because I think the Liberals have 2 seats, Vass and Cottesloe in Perth. So it is really interesting to see why Canning has become a safer seat rather than following the trend. It's really bucked the trend of the rest of the state. I do think that what you'll see at the next state election is the Liberals will pick up a couple more seats. At the next federal election, Liberals will pick up some more seats again because obviously they, despite the distance and despite how different WA is, and that this predates COVID. This is not a COVID thing, as Darren mentioned earlier, you know, with the whole WA protectionist thing. WA's culturally always been seen itself differently. But what it's not immune to is those political trends that we're seeing on the East Coast. We saw that in Curtin, and then we saw obviously this the Labor pick up all of those seats. But I think next time around, that might change. Let's see. It's too early to say, but it is really interesting to see how electorally WA is changing at the moment and why some seats, or one seat, has really shifted towards the Liberals.
Yeah, it could be very different issues at play at the next state and federal elections. Well, the Prime Minister is in Indonesia for a series of high-level talks aimed at rebooting the relationship between Jakarta and Canberra. Joining him on his second overseas trip since becoming PM is a group of frontbenchers and a bevy of high-powered business leaders. Mr Albanese arrived in Jakarta last night and met with President Joko Widodo this afternoon. The pair have been discussing regional security concerns as well as economic partnership and trade. Speaking after their first meeting, the Prime Minister reiterated the importance of the country's shared economic interests.
We're linked not just by geography, we are linked by choice. We've enjoyed a long history of cooperation and friendship, and our relationship is ever deepened by the strategic and economic interests that we share. I also look forward to advancing our $200 million climate and infrastructure partnership with Indonesia. True to my government's ambitious climate targets, I want better access to affordable, reliable and secure clean energy right across our region.
The visit comes a day after it was revealed a Chinese jet intercepted an Australian maritime surveillance aircraft over the South China Sea. During the incident last month, flares were released and the jet dumped aluminium shards in front of the Australian aircraft. The Australian government says it will continue to carry out surveillance in the area.
This incident will not deter Australia from continuing to engage in these activities, which are within our rights at international law, to assure that there is freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, because that is fundamentally in our nation's interest.
Greg, for those who missed it over the weekend, just remind us a little bit more detail about this incident involving the Chinese jet and how serious was it?
Well, Bridget, I believe this is a very serious incident. It's very nearly an act of war. The Australian P-8 Poseidon aircraft was conducting routine maritime surveillance in the South China Sea. China has occupied and constructed a number of islands in the South China Sea, and it doesn't believe that anyone else has the right to transit there. So we don't recognise their sovereignty of those islands, but nonetheless our ships and planes stay outside the 12 nautical mile zone, which is an exclusive economic zone. Now, the Chinese fighter jets and also vessels have a long history now of aggressively interacting with American, Japanese and Taiwanese forces in the region, and occasionally us. But this was the most aggressive action they've ever taken against anyone. They flew right next to our plane, they cut it off, went straight in front of its nose, They released, flares, and then they released chaff, aluminium chaff, which is, you release that in order to get a missile to hit that instead of hitting you. But the chaff was then ingested in the Australian P8 engine. Now, nobody was killed or injured, but this is an incredibly reckless and dangerous thing. It shows that the Chinese Air Force was quite sanguine about the possible loss of Australian life. I think the Albanese government has responded quite rightly to this. They've publicised the incident, which the Chinese don't like. They've complained very strongly to Beijing about it, and they have rightly said that we won't be deterred from undertaking our normal transit rights in the South China Sea, including maritime surveillance. But this happens at the same time as China says it wants a new relationship with Australia. So those things don't add up, but I think they're reconciled because the government in Beijing is just increasingly assertive and aggressive in the region, and it basically issues this demand: tremble and obey. And if you obey, you'll get a pat on the head, and if you don't, you're in big trouble. Now, this might just be a one-off. They do that sort of thing sometimes. If it becomes a pattern, it's extraordinarily dangerous.
We've heard from the government that there'll be a slight tone shift in some of the rhetoric and the language around China and a potential reset to the relationship, or that, whatever that means. Do you think that Richard Marles' comments were in line with what we would have heard from the Morrison government? Could you see any changes there on our diplomacy?
Yes, I think, again, the Albanese government is well advised to tone down a little bit the rhetoric. Let me say, though, while I was critical of the Morrison government for exaggerating the rhetoric, I don't think that was the cause of the problem with China. We don't have a problem with China because, Peter Dutton spoke of war much more often than I thought he should have done. I think any speaking of war is ill-advised. And Morrison himself also was a bit over the top. But I regard that as very marginal, very marginal. Now, in substance, the Albanese government has responded in the same way as the Morrison government. It's publicised it, it's complained about it, and it's said we won't be deterred. Now, what they've said, Marles, I thought was very wise today to say that he was going to follow Teddy Roosevelt's advice, walk quietly and carry a big stick. Well, that means we need to invest heavily in new defence capabilities within our own area, not, these long-term submarines that might come along in 30 years' time or something. We need missiles and drones and so on within our own area. And the tone is a little bit moderated. That's a good thing. But the substance of the disagreement is just as strong. So China did this after the election of the Albanese government. It's impossible for anybody to attribute this to the Morrison government or anything like that. But I would praise the Albanese government for the manner of its response.
Darren, China remains our biggest trading partner. How do we balance the need for diplomacy and an important relationship there with incidents like this?
Yeah, well, that's the big question, isn't it? And I think it's important to note, Greg, you were saying, near a near act of war. I heard Air Marshal Brown, the former Chief of Air Force, today speaking about it, and he was very much downplaying this, saying that it was a fairly typical mode of interception by a fighter jet on a surveillance aircraft. So it's interesting to hear different sides of the story. We're walking a tightrope, and this is the big question in foreign policy for Australia at the moment. We're walking this tightrope, and it's why Penny Wong's off in the Pacific, twice since they've been elected. And there's no doubt that China was testing us with the timing of this to see how the new government would respond. And I think so far, they've kind of got the tone just about right. They've sort of said, look, this is not acceptable. But I think they're also looking, and the tone from the Chinese has been a little bit conciliatory to say, look, let's try and restart some form of dialogue, and we have to have dialogue. There's nothing in backing down by having a chat to these people and keeping the dialogue open. I mean, I think that's really important because a lot of Australian businesses are suffering at this. The wine industry's been decimated because they can't export to China. Lots of other industries have been decimated. So we need to, it's an important part of our economy, and we can't destroy that just for the sake of rhetoric, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Aisha, you're Indonesian, and this trip to Jakarta has become a sort of traditional first visit for prime ministers. But where do we take this diplomacy? How do we move it to the next level? And you've spoken a bit about the diaspora, in Perth especially, but across the country. What do we need to be hearing from Indonesian Australians about how important this relationship is and how we can take it in a new direction?
Yes, like you said, I am half Indonesian. I was born in Indonesia, came here to Australia when I was 6 weeks old. So I have been educated here, my children were born here, and all of my family, most of them are in the village in Indonesia in different cities, including Jakarta and Makassar and all over the place. And it's been quite frustrating actually on the ground, because I see it's not just from the federal level, but also from the state level. I genuinely believe that the relationship between Australia and Indonesia has gone backwards, at least in the last decade, if not longer. I believe it has been on the decline, and it's not just about having a transactional relationship or creating these superficial signs of friendship. It's kind of like a marriage. You have to invest in your marriage during the good times so that when the proverbial does hit the fan, you've got credits to draw from. And that just hasn't been taking place. I'm not a marriage counsellor, by the way, so don't exactly have a good history. But anyway, the point is that friendships have to be built over the long term, because you've got to build resilience, and it's got to be genuine friendship building, and it's got to be beyond the rhetoric. I don't believe that a lot of Australians, like the average Australian, even knows much about Indonesian culture. I mean, for some parts of Australia, we're actually closer to Indonesia than we are to Canberra or the other side of the country. And I think there's so much potential. And I like the tone that's been struck. I think it's very helpful. But again, I'm just holding my breath. Like was mentioned, with B2B relations have been quite damaged, not just between Australia and China, but also between our country and Indonesia. If we look at the facts say that the economic projections for the GDP of Indonesia will set it on a trajectory by 2045 will be the 4th largest economy in the world. Australia will fall to number 27. And I think that a little bit of humility and a greater spirit of cooperation that's based on genuine mutual interests will actually benefit Australia's economic position in the long term. And it's not just about economics, it's also about cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Love thy neighbour. We cannot change the fact that geographically they are our closest neighbour, and yes, they happen to be the largest Muslim majority country in the world. That might make some people feel a little bit uncomfortable, but I can assure you that Indonesians are generally the most tolerant, open-minded people, and that's why sitting in Perth, WA, I often get really frustrated and I start to lose hope, wondering, are the leaders ever going to create the right architecture or deliver so that people at the grassroots, like myself, also those in Indonesia, those in the creative economy sector, which is absolutely going gangbusters in Indonesia, and yet we are not tapping into any of that potential. So I don't wish to be cynical. Albo's visit to Indonesia filled me with some hope, but I'm still very cautiously optimistic.
Well, Erin, the Indo-Pacific is trapped in a pretty rough tug of war between the US and China. Where does Australia sit in that? Because that is a delicate balance, isn't it?
Well, I think the Indo-Pacific is so much more than just China and the United States. And, those stats have just been exemplified with Indonesia and obviously the rise of India as well, which will also be a top 4 economy, whereas we won't feature in that G20 anymore. This region, it is going to be the most contested region in the world probably for the next 50 years, right? I can't even think beyond that. But it will be the most contested region, and that is both in economic terms, it's in military terms, it's in strategic terms, and it is going to be such a wild ride here. So we not only have to think about US-China competition, we have to think about our relationship with China, our relationship with the US, our relationship with Southeast Asia and ASEAN, and I think that will be strengthened under a Penny Wong with Penny Wong as the Foreign Minister, we have to think about some real complexities with, say, for example, India. And we've just seen that in the last 24 hours blow up, where one of the, well, actually, a couple of government spokespeople made some comments that were seen by the Arab states as offensive, and that has led to this absolute diplomatic stoush between many countries and India, where you have an enormous Indian diaspora. In fact, those countries such as Saudi Arabia, the entire Gulf Cooperation Council has put out a statement, Kuwait, Qatar and others, making comments to India because they have enormous workforces that rely on India. Now, what does this mean for Australia? You're probably thinking, what on earth is she talking about? But, we have relationships with countries in Southeast Asia like Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. We have relationships with Malaysia, which obviously also has a large Muslim population. So when things like this happen with India, who we keep talking about we have shared interests and shared values with, how do we navigate that kind of stuff? And again, I think Penny Wong probably is the right person at the moment. Also, Tim Watts, who's the Assistant Minister in a Foreign Affairs portfolio as well. These people have really good competency in navigating the region. So I absolutely think that they're in the right place at the right time. And thankfully, as a country, we've invested in people like that in terms of their Asia capability as well. So it is going to be a really contested region. There's going to be more of this. There's not going to be less. And the US and China are a big part of that, but it is a lot more complex. And again, it's already been raised. Penny's got on the plane. She's gone overseas. She's gone to the Pacific. She's making all the right moves now. She obviously had a strategy in place. Let's see what happens.
Well, Penny will be spending a lot of time on a plane over the next few years. And before we move on, I just want to mention this. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will face a no confidence vote in the coming hours as ill feeling grows among Conservative backbenchers about his government's involvement in the Partygate scandal. In 2020 and 2021, a series of parties were held at his residence at number 10 Downing Street in breach of COVID restrictions. More than 54 Conservative MPs have now written letters of no confidence, triggering a ballot. Greg, Boris Johnson's been on the ropes for a while, but it looks like his backbenchers are revolting after, what has been months and months of coverage about this Partygate. We can joke about it, but it distressed a lot of people in Britain to see these revelations at a time when so many people were locked down, didn't it?
Yeah, it sure did. Look, I think Boris Johnson is in a great deal of trouble. He is certainly, there's no politician quite like him in the world. He is certainly the wittiest, cleverest, funniest politician I've ever interviewed, and also the most courteous. After quite a sort of a robust interview, he sent me a handwritten note of thanks for going out of my way to interview him. Well, that's absolutely astounding. But he's an incredible paradox. I mean, you wonder at the things he has skated through and survived in his career. So you think, he's untouchable, he's a genius, he can get through anything. But then at the same time, you wonder about the bad judgment that he's displayed to get himself into so much trouble. Now, at one level, it would be a travesty for him to fall over, what is a sort of an ambiguous drinks gathering in his own backyard.
Was it ambiguous though, Greg? I mean, the police were involved at one stage.
No, but I was going to say, on the other hand, he is the one. So, the second half of that statement is, on the other hand, he is the one who imposed those COVID regulations on everyone. The only reason the police were involved was to see if it was a breach of COVID regulations. I mean, people didn't get drunk and disorderly or anything like that. But he imposed those regulations on the whole British population. So how can he have such bad judgment? At one level, he's a political genius. He won the Battle of Brexit. He won the biggest majority any Prime Minister has got in Britain since Tony Blair, and he won it for the Conservatives. He won the mayoralty of London twice in a popular election. This is astounding for a modern Conservative. And yet, at the other hand, he has such bad judgment that he would breach his own COVID regulations, and nothing is more designed to generate the ill will. He's a little bit, in a way, a tiny little bit like Barnaby Joyce. Until Barnaby fell, you thought he just had an instinctive rapport with a certain segment of the Australian population, but then he fell and it was irreparable. I suspect that even if Johnson survives this no confidence motion, which he well might, that he is profoundly damaged. You can't absolutely rule out a comeback, but I think he's a gravely damaged political leader.
Well, we'll know Boris Johnson's fate by tomorrow, and win or lose, we'll explain what it all means here on The Drum. But why? If you're a parent of young children, it's a question you would have heard a lot. And while it can be easy to dismiss the endless stream of questions that come with young children, there are some who think that many kids display signs of deep philosophical thought. In a new book called Nasty, British and Short, law and philosophy professor Scott Herovich explains why children actually make the best philosophers.
I think every kid, like every single kid, is a philosopher. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First, they're new in the world and they're just puzzled by it. They're confused by almost everything they encounter. They've got lots of questions. They don't yet know what the standard explanations are or what adults take for granted, and they're just trying to think things through. Another reason is they're not afraid of seeming silly. So they just put their ideas out there. They're not worried about being wrong, and silly is kind of the business they're in. It wasn't all that long after my first child, Rex, came along, that I noticed I would just talk about him a lot in class. So if we were having a conversation about authority, I'd tell my class how at 3 he learned to say, "You're not the boss of me." And I'd say, look, I kind of think I am, but why? What should I tell him? One night at dinner says, "I wonder if I'm dreaming my entire life." And so we had a conversation about Descartes and dream skepticism. Hank reinvented something called Pascal's wager. One day I asked him, do you believe in God? And he said, "I don't want to talk about this." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because God would get angry if he's real." Rex reinvented an ancient argument from a guy named Archytas about the size of the universe. One day we were walking home from school and Rex told me that the universe is infinite. And I said, "I don't know, buddy, scientists aren't sure about that. Some think it's infinite. Some people think it's just really, really big, but finite." And he said, "No, the universe has to be infinite." And he made this argument. He said, if you go all the way to the end of the universe, if you're in a spaceship and you get right there and you punch your hand, it's got to go somewhere, right? And I said, "Well, what if it just stops?" And he said, "Then you're not at the end yet." And actually, that's an argument that reoccurs throughout history. I think that all kids are doing this, and what's special about me is not that my kids are, following in my footsteps as philosophers. It's just that I'm attuned to this. So I hear what they say, and I know to connect it to Descartes or connect it to Pascal or connect it to Archytas, and a lot of parents don't have that context. One thing that's really lovely about philosophy conversations with kids is that they can be collaborative, because the grown-up doesn't know the answer and is not just in the position of teaching something. You don't teach your kids philosophy, you do philosophy with them. I definitely see kids as my Trojan horse here, right? I say in the book that I'm not after young minds, I'm after the adults who are reading the book, because kids are going to do philosophy with or without you. And so what I'm hoping that 2 things will happen. I'm hoping that the adults in their lives will notice and encourage them and engage them. And I'm also hoping that those adults will recapture some of the wonder that kids have at the world.
How cool to have a philosopher for a dad. Yeah. Great. Darren, what questions from little people have totally stumped you, and what do they reveal about how do we make sense of the world?
So my favourite one from my kids was, we were listening to something one day about expanding universes. And so they wanted to know, what's the universe expanding into? Which is a pretty mind-blowing question, right? And it gets to the very heart. I mean, there was a Nobel Prize awarded for that not that long ago on the expanding universe. I couldn't answer that question. But what I think it shows, it shows they have a facile approach. They don't know that there's no such thing as a stupid question. And so the questions are really valid. Now, whether that constitutes philosophy, because, philosophy is a structured way of thinking and a structured way of approaching those questions. So it's one thing to ask the question, and they're beautiful questions. But when I get those questions, my response is to walk them through, okay, how would we find an answer to that? Who would we talk to, or what information could we look for, or how would we actually think our way out of that question? Because that's what philosophy is, and that's what science is essentially as well. And kids are innately scientific in the way they approach the world as well. So it's a real opportunity to engage kids in a way of thinking that we spend an awful lot of time in their school and university teaching them to do. and kind of harnessing that raw question into something that might be much more useful to them as they get older.
Yeah. Aisha, what's been your experience of dealing with tricky or curious questions from your kids?
Yeah, well, I have 2 boys, and my eldest is now 18 and my youngest is 14, but certainly in our household, any question to do with religion and philosophy was always encouraged. I myself, as an 11-year-old, I went through my own existential crisis, which precipitated a real period of soul searching and, dare I say, darkness, as I wanted to explore all kinds of different religions and philosophical frameworks. And because I was given that space, seeing that my father was a Greek Orthodox man and my mother not so much of a practicing Muslim, I felt like I had the space to explore. And I really encouraged that in my children, and that wonderful book is really, the premise is about always trying to maintain a childlike curiosity, because that allows us to grow, not just spiritually, but also to ask the big questions of life. Now, a lot of people are not comfortable with that. And sure, you know, I did philosophy in my undergrad. I did Logic 101 in law school. You understand syllogisms and they all help, but that's not the point. The point isn't about necessarily having the structured thinking. I think the starting point is just wanting to know and questioning if there is more to life, asking some of those big questions. What is truth? What are absolute and relative truths? And so I've always encouraged my children to ask those difficult questions. And when I've had a teacher at one of their schools come and say to me, well, your son questioned something about his religion that I found really offensive. And I said, well, you've got it wrong. I think doubt is the pathway to truth and to conviction, and no one can get to faith without asking those questions. Doubt is so integral to that process, and I was so proud that my son had the courage to rebel a little bit and a lot. I'm happy for him to rebel as much as he wishes.
That's great parenting in my view. Well, Greg, I mean, sometimes kids have questions around belief and also questions around tragedy and sadness. But what does that reveal to us about some of those questions that we don't have the answer to, and we have to sit with those?
Well, that's right, Bridget. So my family, both the family I grew up in and my own family, are quite religious. So a lot of our philosophical musings have been about God. Certainly when I was a kid myself, about 7 or 8, our youngest sister, Mary, died in hospital. And every night that she was in hospital, my brother and my father and I would kneel by my brother's bed and pray for her. And we were confident that we'd stormed heaven with our prayers and that she would come out of hospital back to us. And when she died, you know, I was asking my dad, how come God didn't answer our prayers? And he had to explain to me, and he couldn't do it in one session, that God is neither silent nor deaf, but he doesn't always respond in the way that you want. And that's part of the mystery of God. I agree with Aisha that doubt is integral to faith. And certainly, as Aisha described her household, we were very open to having those discussions. And I think the final thought is, I think it's a quality that childhood shares with old age. You have the time and the leisure and the disposition to think about the ultimate meaning of things, whereas for much of your adulthood, you're just very busy with the daily busyness of life.
Thanks for sharing that, Greg. Well, Erin, just quickly before we run out of time, do we tell little people and children that we don't have the answer, or do we try and find something?
Of course, and we work it through. I tell my daughter all the time, I've got no idea what you're asking about. I've got no idea the answer to your question. But as someone who, you know, undergraduate philosophy, I've got a doctor of philosophy, innately want to go and find those answers. In fact, it's not innate. I've been trained to want to go and find those answers in a systematic way, and we work through them with her. And that curiosity is just, I mean, it's an absolute joy. I went to the border of Syria a few years ago, and I came back and showed my daughter the photos, and she looked at me like she was born in 1913, not 2013, and she's like, Mum, tell me about the war. And we had to kind of unpack that with her. And you know, so taking kids on that journey, I think it's actually part of the joy of parenthood, really makes you stop in those tracks that Greg was just talking about, where you are caught up between the office and running to work and looking after parents, and everything's just so chaotic. And then, you know, your 6-year-old comes out with a question like that about war, and you have to sit there and think, how am I going to explain this to this child? I can't just brush over it. Otherwise, you know, I'm not going to foster that philosophical mindset that she clearly has and has been fostered in our household. So, yeah, I mean, I actually think it's a real joy.
One of the many joys and time-consuming joys of parenthood.
Indeed.
Well, thanks to our panel. That's all we've got time for. Thanks so much to Dr. Darren Saunders, Erin Watson-Lynn, Greg Sheridan and Aishan Navakovic. Kath Robinson is with you tomorrow night. Have an excellent evening.
Chill with the best entertainment this winter.
Whoa! Dogs have undergone an amazing journey from woof to our best friend.
What are you doing?
We're selling an idea of summers that never end.
There's nothing better than getting trapped emotions and releasing them to the world.
Subtle.
I saw it on an ad.
Must be true.
Stream for free on ABC iView.
Pedal power in Indonesia. Anthony Albanese cements his relationship with President Joko Widodo. Perth city businesses innovate to boost foot traffic with workers slow to return as COVID lingers. West Australian Minjee Lee claims the biggest title in women's golf with a dominant victory at the US Open.
I mean, this is pretty special. This is the one that I've always wanted to win since I was a little kid.
And coming up on The Business, will Labor follow through on its election promise to protect workers and wages?
Welcome to ABC Late News. I'm Michael Tetlow. Anthony Albanese will go to the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali later this year, despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's possible attendance. The Prime Minister made the promise during his first state visit to Indonesia, where he and President Joko Widodo agreed to strengthen economic and strategic ties. Political reporter Jane Norman is in Jakarta.
Two leaders in tandem. Australia's new Prime Minister welcomed in unique style.
It's a bamboo bike. Yeah, bamboo bike.
A presidential nod to both men's humble beginnings. From bicycles to botany, and finally bilateral talks on the grounds of Bogor's lush presidential palace. Anthony Albanese's seeking the deepest of ties with Australia's largest neighbour and confirming he'll be back later this year.
I will attend the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali in November. The work of the G20 is critical at this time of global economic uncertainty.
I am happy that Indonesia is the destination for Prime Minister Albanese's first bilateral visit.
The Prime Minister's following a familiar flight path to his predecessors. It was Malcolm Turnbull who forged the closest of bonds with Jokowi.
That's a very good idea. Great idea.
Paving the way for a trade deal to be inked by Scott Morrison. But still, Australia's economic partnership with this country of 270 million is yet to reach its full potential. So, Mr Albanese has brought reinforcements, frontbenchers, including Australia's first Muslim cabinet minister, and a bevy of business leaders.
We have enormous opportunity for growth. Indonesia is going to be a top 5 economy in the globe.
As the Prime Minister prepared to leave for Indonesia, fresh tensions flared with Beijing, with confirmation a Chinese fighter jet had come perilously close to downing an Australian Air Force plane over the South China Sea.
We regard the actions of China in this area as being an act of aggression and a dangerous act.
Indonesia's largest trading partner is China, but Jakarta has made it clear it's not picking sides in the great power rivalry playing out on its doorstep. But as the biggest democracy among Southeast Asian nations, Indonesia will be critical in defending the rules-based order in a region facing pressure from an autocratic Beijing. Jane Norman, ABC News, Jakarta.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will face the biggest test of his leadership in the coming hours when his party holds a confidence vote. The Conservative leader has resisted calls from dozens of Tory politicians to resign over a series of parties held at Downing Street during a strict COVID lockdown. At least 54 MPs have written letters to trigger the ballot. The results will be known in the morning, Australian time. If Mr Johnson survives the vote, he won't face another challenge for a year. Queen Elizabeth has delighted celebrating crowds with a surprise appearance on the final day of festivities, marking her 70 years on the throne. The 96-year-old monarch had only appeared twice during the 4-day Platinum Jubilee, but she wrapped up celebrations on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, with the future of the royal family clearly on display. Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins has more.
The Jubilee Parade had all the pomp and pageantry fit for a queen. Her Majesty appeared as a hologram, waving to the crowds from the 260-year-old state coach that carried her to her coronation in 1953. But the military procession soon took on a street carnival vibe, with displays representing the 7 decades of the Queen's reign. There was plenty of colour and even more cheer. Characters from the super quirky to supermodels. The young royals watched on, a playful Prince Louis, not content to stay in his seat, finally settling for his granddad's knee. But it was the Queen herself who stole the show. After 2 days out of the spotlight due to mobility issues, she was back, flanked by 3 generations of royals, a rock star turnout for a long reigning monarch.
Really quite emotional. My nan brought me to the Golden Jubilee when I was a child, and it was something that always stuck with me, so I wanted to bring my kids along to witness the same thing.
The Queen's surprise appearance on the balcony might have buoyed crowds, but her absence throughout the weekend was noticed. This country saw much more of Prince Charles and Prince William, with commentators saying a transition is already underway in the British monarchy. In the Royal Gardens at Windsor, there was plenty of party spirit.
We will attempt the world's longest loyal toast.
Many here hope to one day see a king in the castle.
I'll be happy for Charles. He's been king in waiting for a very long time.
The Platinum Jubilee will long live in the national memory as the Queen plans for the future of the institution she served for more than 70 years. Isabella Higgins, ABC News, London.
Russia has launched a missile strike on Ukraine's capital Kiev for the first time in more than a month. Russia said the strikes destroyed tanks supplied by Eastern European countries, but Ukrainian authorities said it was a train repair shop with no military equipment. The Russian president has warned any Western deliveries of longer-range rocket systems will prompt Moscow to strike new targets.
If they are going to be supplied, we'll make certain conclusions and use our own means of destruction, which we will have enough to strike at those targets which we have not yet been hitting.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met troops on the front line in his first visit to the Donbass region since the start of the invasion. New COVID cases in WA have fallen to their lowest level in nearly 3 months, with the state reporting fewer than 5,000 new infections. But while the state's Omicron wave fades, the impact of the pandemic in Perth's CBD is badly hurting some businesses.
Not everything is as it seems at Nancy Feng's Perth Cafe, including her usual customers.
To be honest, we don't really focus on the business people here.
Even though she's at the base of a 12-storey office building, she's used social media and some unique offerings to entice customers in.
Especially with our desserts as well, you probably can't see anywhere in Perth. So everything here is unique.
It means she hasn't missed CBD workers who've chosen to work at home, particularly when masks were mandatory. But on the opposite side of the terrace, Anthony Arnold's had a different view from behind his coffee machine.
It's still probably about 50% away to a third away from where it was beforehand, but definitely noticing, a difference week to week.
Data gathered by tech giant Google shows since the start of the year, the number of people working from city offices has been trending down. It picked up slightly after mask mandates were lifted, but is still below pre-pandemic levels.
I think you'll probably see the closure of a lot of venues, particularly. You've already seen a lot disappear.
And with some of WA's largest employers sticking with flexible work policies, the number of office workers in the CBD may never fully recover, leading to a raft of changes.
There'll probably be open desk offices and probably a smaller floor area than they would have needed with all their staff there.
That might make things tough for CBD retail and hospitality in the short term, but increasing numbers of apartments could change that.
At the moment you are serving the working population between 9 and 5, and you're closed overnight and over the weekends. Whereas if you get more residents within the CBD, then you have that after-hours business as well.
In the short term, the government's hoping it can entice people back with money for events by revitalising Yagan Square. But any significant change will take some time, leaving a difficult road ahead for many CBD businesses. Keith Burke, ABC News.
West Australian Minjee Lee has won the biggest prize in women's golf, taking out the US Open by 4 shots. Lee claimed her second major and picked up $2.5 million, the largest prize money in the history of the women's game.
What a champion.
Walking up the 18th fairway, Minjee Lee was living a scenario she'd acted out as a young girl on golf courses in Western Australia.
I for sure have done it. This is to win the US Open, like for a little 5-footer.
She just ran away from everybody. Minjee Lee.
The 26-year-old joins her mentor, Kari Webb, and Jan Stevenson as the only Australians to win the tournament.
It's such a great honour just to be amongst those two names.
Her younger brother, fellow golf professional Min Woo Lee, was brought to tears, and he won't be the only one inspired by the triumph.
I think this will be huge for all the little girls and even the boys and the children watching.
Lee started her final round with a 3-shot lead over American Mina Haragai and adopted an aggressive approach to extend the advantage.
Rolls in a long birdie putt.
On the 12th hole, the Perth-born player had one hand on the trophy.
Oh, it's a clinic. Wonderful.
Her coach believes Lee deserves a higher profile.
She's now a 2-time major winner. In any other sport, it'd probably be very well known.
Smith says the Women's US Open has set the standard by nearly doubling its total prize money.
There's still 4 majors that are well behind in terms of funding. What we need to realise is that the women work just as hard as the men.
While the winner's cheque will be welcomed, it was the trophy Lee was after.
This is pretty special. This is the one that I've always wanted to win since I was a little kid.
Lee moves to number 2 in the rankings while feeling on top of the world. Duncan Huntsdale, ABC News.
Rafael Nadal has won his 14th French Open Tennis Championship over Norway's Casper Ruud. The 36-year-old now has 2 more Grand Slam victories than his great rivals Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer. But Nadal has revealed he had to play with numbing injections to overcome a chronic condition in his foot that could end his stellar career. National Sport reporter David Mark has the story.
He's done it again. It's a historic 14th Roland Garros title for Nadal.
Every win for Rafael Nadal is creating new records, but this French Open might be the most precious of all his 22 Grand Slams.
Means a lot to me, means everything.
His opponent, Casper Ruud, tried.
Oh, yeah.
But the man who once trained at Nadal's own academy could do little to stop the onslaught, losing 6-3, 6-3, 6-love.
Too good.
I got to feel how it is to play against you in the final, and it's not easy, and I'm not the first victim.
Nadal was playing his own body as much as Ruud, revealing after the match he had injections in his left foot to blunt the pain from a chronic bone condition.
I have no feelings on my foot. My daughter was able to put anesthetic injections on the nerves.
But he's not prepared to do it again, even if it means missing Wimbledon.
If I am able to play with anti-inflammatories, yes. To play with anesthetic injections, no.
He plans to try to burn 2 nerves in his foot, and if that doesn't work, he says he may consider surgery as a final option.
I don't know what can happen in the future, but I'm gonna keep fighting to try to keep going, so many thanks.
At 36, and with a body crying out for him to stop, this may have been Rafael Nadal's last farewell. But if so, he was on the court that allowed him to become, numerically at least, the greatest in history.
I hope, we all hope that you will continue for some more time.
All tennis fans are hoping the same. David Mark, ABC News.
Hey, mostly sunny, 20 degrees tomorrow for Perth, mostly sunny too for Darwin. Showers easing and 15 degrees in Adelaide. Showers and just 8 in Hobart. Melbourne, similar conditions, but a top of 11 degrees. Sydney, mostly sunny and 17. Brisbane, a partly cloudy day with 19. And that is ABC Late News to the moment. I'm Michael Tetlow. Thanks very much for watching. From the team, take care and stay with us for the business.
Welcome to The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, Fair Work. Will Labor follow through on its election promise to protect workers and wages?
On certain minimum standards, particularly the minimum wage, they are going to say, well, you need to be equivalent, you need to be treated in an equivalent way to a traditional full-time employee.
And is the centrepiece of industrial relations law fit for purpose in 2022?
Australia's enterprise agreement system has been on a fast track to collapse for some time.
The new Labor government's industrial relations agenda promises to shake up workplaces across Australia. Largely unexamined during the election campaign, the reforms put secure work at the heart of employment laws, giving more power to workers, including ending rolling contracts and creating new protections for those in the gig economy. Daniel Ziffer reports.
Getting insecure work through rolling contracts or an app makes planning life hard.
It's not that reliable at all. Fuel prices and all the living costs comes up.
It's stressful. It's a juggle. It's a juggle with time, it's a juggle with money and the budget.
Workers could soon get a break if the new government follows through on election promises to change workplace laws.
It's potentially major changes if the proposals are actually enacted, or even if they're not enacted, some of them can be done administratively.
Fueling the changes, soaring corporate profits have severed the link between companies doing well and employees sharing in the prosperity. Labor has promised to enshrine secure work and gender pay equity in workplace laws and give gig economy workers protections and benefits closer to standard employees.
On certain minimum standards, particularly the minimum wage, they are going to say, well, you need to be equivalent, you need to be treated in an equivalent way to a traditional full-time employee.
Protections Nabin is looking forward to.
So that will just keep us safe, secure. We are never having a stable income source, like, we can be dismissed anytime.
Unions say tech companies have too much power.
Massive gig behemoths are now starting to structure their work so that these workers are fighting with each other for scraps. Now, that is not what the Australian economy wants. It's not what the Australian community wants.
But those who operate online platforms don't see how it can work. Mabel links people needing aged and disability care with support workers.
It's people connecting directly with each other. Mabel is not setting the terms of those engagements. We're not establishing rates. It's the small businesses engaging directly with their clients.
And business groups don't see a problem that needs solving.
In fact, job security has arguably never been better. We have an unemployment rate of 3.9%. We have employment growing. We have record levels of vacancies across the economy.
But workers disagree. For years, Janine worked as a contractor or temp, without holidays, sick pay or superannuation.
Usually going from paycheck to paycheck, so planning is just keeping a roof over your head. It's really the basics.
Now in a secure role, she hopes others will get the same stability and sense of possibility.
Housing, education, future prospects, they'd just be able to live a more secure life.
We still don't have much detail about the changes and when the government wants to put its election promises into action. But for people caught in a cycle of contracts and precarious positions, the future could hold more security.
The new government has proposed a job summit in September.
It has to be all about driving flexibility and getting productivity outcomes.
This could make a fundamental difference to how we view work.
Changing lives for future generations.
That's what I work for, that my daughter can get an education and hopefully get that secure employment further on.
Making work better.
Daniel Ziffer there. Well, key to the discussion at the upcoming Industrial Relations Roundtable will be enterprise bargaining agreements. Alison Pennington from the Centre for Future Work says the current system is not fit for purpose.
Australia's enterprise agreement system has been on a fast track to collapse for some time. We are at the point now, actually, where the number of private sector workers who are covered by a current enterprise agreement is at 11%. So we've seen a halving of the coverage of the system across the private sector since 2013. So it's, one of the ways that we can point to the fact that the system isn't fit for purpose is we hear a lot about the growth of forms of contracting and franchising and the fissuring of businesses to become smaller and smaller or to design their practices in different ways. And one of the best insights we have into that is the explosion in the number of very small firms in Australia. We've had since 2004 a growth of over 200,000 small firms with 1 to 4 employees. And at the same time, when you look at the larger scales of firms with over 200 employees, we've lost over 1,000 of those firms. So when we talk about the design of our economy, the design of our business is changing, and the design of our enterprise agreement system and our industrial relations system being out of kilter, that's the type of mismatch that we're looking at now.
So if the enterprise bargaining system was designed for an economy that no longer exists, what are the key elements on how it should be designed for a contemporary Australia?
So I think that we have to start from the first port of call on talking about enterprise bargaining. It's about bargaining. There has to be some design elements of a system that facilitate and support bargaining. At this point in time, the system doesn't facilitate that. The Fair Work Act doesn't protect or enshrine the right to genuine bargaining with proper employee representatives. So designing a new system will be about looking at the genuine ways that employers organise operations and ensuring that employees can organise themselves to meaningfully negotiate for their wages and conditions in relation to that employer bargaining power. So I think for the first important point for redesigning the system would be looking at expanding the bargaining scope. At this point, we have it fixed in law at an enterprise level. And that's just not the way that workers relate to each other and employers coordinate their businesses. So expanding that bargaining scope would include things like multi-employer, whether that be more than one, but it could also be about setting wages and conditions and negotiating for those conditions and wages across an industry, across a sector, perhaps for people of a similar job across Australia. So these are the types of the organisation of bargaining we have in the Nordic countries and lots of Western Europe, and where a lot of the Anglophone economies are moving towards as well.
Well, the economy now has to take into account, gig workers, as you were sort of alluding to there. Labor has promised to establish minimum paying conditions for gig and employee-like workers, but how can EBAs be struck for these types of workers when they're often dealing with apps or algorithms for their pay and hours?
The problem we have with the realms of gig work is that by law, these workers are not defined as employees. And so when it comes to, and it remains to be seen what we see in changes from the Employment Summit and new industrial relations laws from the new Labor government. But if we are to start really introducing proper tests around the work that these gig workers do, we can, by all those genuine tests of employee-like work, we would say that these workers are like employees. They don't have agency and control over their work. And in that sense, when we are talking about bargaining rights, we've had some steps toward the capacity of gig workers to collectively bargain. That happened through changes to the Competition Consumer Commission's framework for contractors. But what we need to see now is that continued progress on that into the industrial relations system.
And I guess when you look back to 2009, when the Fair Work Act was designed, it was there to drive economic prosperity and be mutually beneficial for both the worker and the employer. What do you think the biggest challenges are for the upcoming industrial relations round table, and what do you think needs to be achieved there?
It's about the source of confidence and investment. And that's from there, that's where we get productivity. And you'll hear productivity be rolled out time and again. Everyone's got different claims to it. As an economist, I can tell you that there's a lot of misuse or, let's say, misdefinitions of productivity. We can't create and continue to propagate an economy in Australia that depends on declining real wages. And that's what some employers define as productivity, but it's not. We have to be talking about long-term horizons for investment, and that's business investment, which is currently at post-war record lows. But it's about people and skills, and everything that makes up an economy is the efforts and the labour of people.
Alison Pennington, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Global miner Rio Tinto is being sued over Australia's wide-ranging sanctions in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russian aluminium producer Rusal is seeking to win back access to its share of the alumina produced at a jointly owned refiner in Queensland after Rio stepped in to take sole control in April. Rio owns 80% of the refinery, while Rusal owns the remaining 20%. Australia banned the export of alumina and aluminium ores, including bauxite, to Russia in March. To markets now, the All Ordinaries and the top 200 both ending around 0.5% lower. Shares in Magellan slumped by 14% after the beleaguered investment firm revealed funds under management fell by $3.6 billion in May. And the Aussie dollar is buying a touch under 72 US cents. I spoke to Michael McCarthy from Tiger Brokers after the market closed. Michael, what happened on the markets today?
Well, it was quite a subdued day, judging by the performance of the Australia 200 index. It fell slightly, about 0.4%, and it looked like fairly quiet trading. However, there was a lot going on. Tech stocks were belted after we saw the Nasdaq drop by almost 2% on Friday night. That translated to a lot of pressure on local tech stocks in trading today. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we saw some really good support for energy stocks. It was the best performing sector, up 1.7%, and some of the stars of that sector, in particular the gas stocks, did even better. Woodside Petroleum today up by more than 3% in trading as it goes into that merger with BHP.
So what's your prognosis then, Michael, for energy companies with the backdrop of the energy crisis here in Australia?
Well, while there's certainly a number of strands to the elevated gas prices that we're seeing at the moment, including, of course, the conflict in the Ukraine, there's been a lot of underinvestment in gas production in Australia because of uncertainty around the future as constrained by carbon dioxide. And that's meant that these gas prices are very hard to meet. The best performers today were those companies that have got production already online to take advantage and those with projects in the pipeline. It was one of the key reasons why Woodside was a top performer today. Now, despite our best intents, the reality is that at this stage we simply do not have the technology and renewables that will allow us to replace gas entirely, and it looks like gas will be a part of Australia's energy mix for years to come.
Now, Michael, we know the RBA meets tomorrow. What's your forecast?
I'm looking for a 0.4% increase, and I think I'm pretty much in line with consensus there. There's almost universal agreement where we will see rates go higher tomorrow. Economists are suggesting a quarter-point raise because they simply haven't seen enough local data since the RBA lifted rates in May, but traders are betting on a much bigger hike. Many of them are looking for 0.4%, others are looking for 0.5%, and three-year bond rates hit an 8-year high in trading last Friday in anticipation of what might be a surprise hike from the RBA.
And how might that all play into the Aussie dollar?
Well, the Aussie dollar has been strengthening in anticipation of that possibility, and we saw it touch a high just below 73 cents on Friday night. It has backed off a little from those levels, but it's no doubt that rising interest rates and strong commodity prices are a potent combination for the Australian dollar, and we could see further significant gains towards that 76-cent level.
And looking towards the end of the week, we've got some key figures out of the US and China.
Yes, we saw important jobs data out of the US on Friday night. And while it was good to see the growth coming through in the US economy, the inflation, as evidenced by increasing hourly wage rates, is concerning. That could be compounded on Friday, where we've got a very big day for markets. During the Asia-Pacific trading session, we'll see inflation data from China. And then on Friday night, we'll see inflation data from the US. And if both of those reads come in line with expectations, I think markets will pretty quickly conclude we're looking at further increases in interest rates, possibly sooner than markets had expected.
Michael McCarthy, great to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Kath.
And that's all from The Business. For more on those stories, head to the ABC News website and you can catch the program anytime on iView. I'm Catherine Robinson. Thanks for your company.
Look, it's a flashy gimmick to market the new season of Growin'.
This is genius. Great advertising.
Featuring your favourite advertising experts.
Collect us all.
Fully customisable to fit your personality. And they'll sing your favourite advertising jingles.
No, we won't, but we will deconstruct the way that brands are trying to sell to you.
It's the new and improved Growin'.
It's the same show as ever. Now let me out of here.
Growin', available Wednesday at the new time of 8 p.m. Free delivery via ABC TV and ABC iView. Battery sold separately.
Join innovators and trailblazers.
How about this for our first date?
For one final trip down memory lane.
I started choreographing my first work here. Wow.
Julia Zamiro's Home Delivery starts Sunday, June 19 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
I'm here in Government House at Yarralumla in Canberra. It's the official residence of the Governor-General, the Queen's representative in Australia. In a moment, something quite historic, but also something very now, is going to happen. It's a video call between Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, the Governor-General, David Hurley, his wife, Linda, and the 4 Australians of the Year. And it's in honour of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, which marks 70 years of service as our Queen. The first time Queen Elizabeth II set foot on our shores was in 1954, 2 years after she became the reigning monarch. Her tour was so extensive that 75% of the population got to see her in person. 9 years later, the Queen, Prince Philip by her side, returned to lead the Canberra Jubilee celebrations, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the naming of the capital. During this time, Prime Minister Robert Menzies honoured Her Majesty with a speech that's etched in the royal history books.
I did but see her passing by
and yet I love her till I die.
The tour heralded a 15,000-kilometre journey across the continent, visiting every state and territory, though much of her time was spent in Western Australia and the Northern Territory.
After this visit, no one will be able to suggest to me that Central Australia is a dead heart. From now on, I shall always look upon it as a living heart, beating with confident energy.
The Queen has toured Australia 16 times, present for many auspicious occasions. The official opening of the Sydney Opera House, opening of the Australian Parliament. And in 1977, thousands of Australians lined the streets to welcome Her Majesty in celebration of her Silver Jubilee. In 1988, the Queen took part in Australia's bicentenary celebrations. She travelled extensively across the nation, including to Brisbane, where she opened the 1988 World Expo.
I know you like to call your state the Sunshine State, but I prefer to think of it by its original name, Queensland.
Her Majesty's last two visits to Australia were in 2006, when she opened the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, and 2011, when she met General David Hurley, who became Governor-General in 2019. As the Queen's representative in Australia, the Governor-General's role includes swearing in Prime Ministers and Ministers, signing new legislation, and hosting official events for heads of state and dignitaries, including Queen Elizabeth II herself. Today, the Governor-General invites the Queen into his home once again, only this time with a very modern twist.
Your Excellency, please tell me the story how a video call with the Queen has come about.
Well, Fran, this is a really exciting year, being the Platinum Jubilee for Her Majesty. And when we were looking at how do you celebrate 70 years of service, 70 years as our Queen, my staff came up with an idea, well, Her Majesty's unable to travel to Australia now. Why don't we take Australia to her? And what's the best way to do that? And we looked around and thought of who would be good representatives. And quite naturally, I think we landed on the Australians of the Year for this year. You know, 4 outstanding people who just represent so much about what Australia is today.
This is your 2022 Australian of the Year Awards.
Australia's local hero for 2022 is Shanna Wan.
Alcohol use is the silent pandemic we are not discussing. And it's a pandemic that is exploding exponentially with COVID-19, no matter your postcode. I've walked the tightrope of this conversation now for 7 years, while speaking the truth of overcoming my own alcoholism and establishing Sober in the Country.
Hi, Shanna. Frank Kelly, lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
How are you feeling about this video call with the Queen tonight?
Yeah, it's an incredible opportunity. I feel really humbled and honoured, which probably sounds like a cliche, but it's not every day you get to say that's what you're going to do, so it'll be lovely.
Thank you. The Young Australian of the Year for 2022 is Dr. Daniel Noor.
As Australians, it's our responsibility to advocate for those who seem to have lost their voice and to rise up to the occasion even when we question our own ability to do so. Let me tell you that, genuinely, my fear was failure, and it almost stopped me from establishing streetside medics. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I remember when the Queen came to Australia and I stood with my dad on one of the main roads and waved at her. And I remember that so clearly because really she's an icon of our nation and our country. So the honour and privilege to be able to see her and have a conversation with her is one I'll remember for the rest of my life.
The Senior Australian of the Year for 2022 is Val Dempsey.
I'm a proud member of St John Ambulance, and our work is for the faith and in the service of humanity. I believe holding out a hand to someone or taking the opportunities to be kind make all the difference and come back to you 1,000-fold.
How are you feeling about this media online call with the Queen tonight?
I'm ecstatic, very humble, excited, overwhelmed, but joyful.
The 2022 Australian of the Year is Dylan Alcott.
For the 4.5 million people in this country, 1 in 5 people that have a physical or non-physical disability, they don't feel the same way that I do. And it's not their fault. But it's up to all of us to do things so they can get out and be proud of their disability as well and be the people that they want to be.
How are you feeling about a video call with the Queen, Dylan?
It's pretty cool. My mum cried when I told her. How lovely is that? So, I mean, I'm just having such an awesome year, and the support that I've had as Australian has been incredible, and it was very strange when I got an email saying the Queen wants to say good day, so I'm really excited.
Would you please put your hands together for Australia's local hero, Shanna Wan.
To our Young Australian of the Year, Dr. Daniel Noor.
To the Senior Australian of the Year, Val Dempsey.
And one more time for our Australian of the Year for 2022, it's Dylan Alcott.
Your Majesty, good evening, good morning to you there in London.
Yes.
I've got 4 very excited people here this evening who we wish to introduce to you, but to say thank you very much for accepting our request for the call. When we were thinking through about how we would celebrate your Jubilee here, one of my staff thought it would be a good idea, seeing you're unable to travel to Australia, that we might bring Australia to you. And who best to do that than to bring you the 4 Australians of the Year for 2022. So I have with me, of course, Linda.
Yes, nice to see you again.
Good morning, Your Majesty.
And then on my right, Mr. Dylan Alcott, who is the Australian of the Year for 2022. And to his right, Ms. Shanna Wan, who is the local hero of Australia for 2022. And then over on my left, Ms. Val Dempsey, who is our Senior Australian of the Year. And next to her, Dr. Daniel Noor, who is the Young Australian of the Year. And so we're, as I say, delighted to be here. And coincidentally, this is the exact day, 34 years ago, that you opened Parliament House here. So we didn't plan, we didn't plan that, but it occurred. So it might invoke some memories for you of your time here.
Indeed, trying to avoid that bit of water.
Yes, down the front there.
Yeah. Well, no, inside. I don't know whether it's still there, but there's this little pond inside. Yes. It intrigued me very much indeed. I wondered how many people had fallen into it.
Yes, right in the middle. Sorry, it's a long time since I've been there. So I'll start with Dylan as our Australian of the Year. Dylan.
Cool. Hi, Your Majesty. Thanks for coming to chat to us. This is awesome. My name's Dylan Alcott, and I still can't believe it, but I got named Australian of the Year for the singles titles playing wheelchair tennis. I unfortunately won a couple of Wimbledon titles, beat some Great Britain players, which I was happy about, but maybe you weren't so happy about. And the reason I get out of bed every day is to change perceptions, so people with disability, people like me, can get out and live the lives they deserve to live. And I just want to use my platform to shine a light on that, to help employment opportunities, help people get out there and live the lives that they want to live. And to be given this honour to be Australian of the Year, I get emotional talking about it, to be honest, because to have any... When I was a young kid, I used to hate myself, Your Majesty, and to see if I thought anybody in a wheelchair, let alone myself, would be Australian of the Year, I wouldn't have believed you. So, yeah, a huge honour. And when I told my mum last night that I was getting to meet you, she cried. How cool is that? So I think I've made her very proud as well. So, yeah, a real honour for me to be here today. Thank you.
So you've actually retired, have you, from your tennis?
I'm retired now, so I'm looking forward to coming to Wimbledon and actually drinking a Pimm's this time, rather than playing the whole time. You know what I mean? It's going to be.
Oh, right.
It's going to be fun. But yeah, I had a great career, but I think it's time for me to, do something else and use my platform to help more people. And I'm really excited about the opportunity.
That's wonderful to be helping other people. So that's what you'll be focusing on, is it?
Yeah, exactly right. I've got a foundation where we help young people with disability achieve their dreams through university scholarships, funding startups, all kinds of stuff around Australia, and really, shining a light on some of the things that people with disability often haven't had the opportunity to do through employment, mainstream schools, all kinds of stuff, participation in sport. And I've got to give you credit, the London Paralympics changed the game for so many people like me. It really was one of the best moments of my life playing there, and I think the rest of the world has followed suit now. And yeah, I'm coming to Great Britain to do some work. All around the world, I really want to try and do what I've been able to do here, you know, globally now as well, which is pretty cool.
Good. Well, that's splendid to hear about that. Good.
Thank you, Dylan. And if I could introduce again Shanna, off to you.
Hello, Your Majesty. Thank you so very much for making time to meet us. It's lovely to meet you. This year I was very fortunate to win the Australian Local Hero of the Year. So that's a category that recognises community grassroots service that is above and beyond. For about 7 years now, I have committed my entire life and heart and soul to service to the community in a very specific area, which is in rural and remote Australia. And in particular, I work through my charity that I founded, which is called Sober in the Country, and I'm raising awareness around alcohol harm, specifically in rural and remote areas where the barriers of permanent isolation, as we call it, never end. Yeah. And I suppose it would be fair to say that my passion is to ensure that the people who get up and show up in floods and fires and droughts to feed the rest of this amazing country are supported when they need some help in their own time of need. And tragically, alcohol abuse and indeed addiction is a big issue for us in the bush in Australia. So that is my passion, and I do that because I nearly died about 7 years ago from my own battle with alcoholism. So it's a cause very dear to my heart from lived experience, and that's what I do.
Well, I think that's marvellous. I mean, during the pandemic, that must have been quite difficult to do, wasn't it?
The pandemic ended up being an interesting situation for us because actually what it did was it proved what I have been saying to the country, I suppose, and even the globe for a long time now, which is when people are in isolation, the barriers to getting help and support are amplified and exacerbated. And so, in fact, we're kind of the experts in ISO because that's our normal, if you know what I mean. So it's been...
Yes, I can see that, yes.
It's been an interesting couple of years, Your Majesty, really interesting.
I'm sure, yes. Whereabouts do you live?
So my husband and I and our 2 dogs and our 2 horses, I just had to throw that in there because I know you love your dogs and horses. So we live in northwestern New South Wales in a little teeny tiny wooden church in the bush. And I travel and speak when I'm not home.
Well, that's very interesting to hear about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shanna.
Very much.
Could I introduce Mrs. Val Dempsey again? Val is our Senior Australian of the Year, and she could talk about herself, but I could say, Your Majesty, every time I turn up to a disaster site, one of the people I bump into is Val, but I'll let her tell her own story.
Good morning, Your Majesty. What a pleasure and an honour to meet you. I'm a very, very long-time volunteer with St John Ambulance, Australia.
Yes.
I'm also a commander in the Order of St John.
Are you?
I am, and that was conferred on me recently for work that has involved probably over 50 years of being with St John Ambulance. I personally would love to see, and my aim is, that people who are driving vehicles should learn first aid. It's an absolute passion of mine. We had a dreadful moment in our family life many years ago that has led me to believe that first aid, bystander first aid at the scene of an accident actually makes a massive, big difference. Those 5 to 7 minutes before the ambulance or help arrives, the person pulling up at a car accident, if they have first aid training, they can actually save a life. We have something like 40,000 people a year recovering and living with injuries from road trauma, and I would dearly like to be able to promote the idea of learner drivers taking on first aid training as part of their driver's licence. Because whenever I drive around where I live here in Canberra, all I can see is other drivers and they're all potential first aiders. I don't see mothers and fathers, I see first aiders. And so it would be really a wonderful thing if we could inspire all peoples to be able to learn first aid, because it will make a marvellous difference right the way across our community. And so for that reason, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to raise that issue.
It sounds a very sensible idea too, because obviously it does help enormously if one does know something about first aid.
Indeed it does, you're quite right. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to talk about this today is that recently I had the pleasure of being in our wonderful top north region of New South Wales, where sadly the community up there was devastated. In the Lismore Twin Rivers region, the Richmond River flooded and other rivers, and the water rose some 35 feet and wiped out this whole community. I went in as a first aid person to set up a medical unit there. The amazing resilience of that community up there, it really has reinforced the goodness in people and in the human nature. It was such a privilege to be a part of that.
Well, it's nice to hear that there are people that are so brave and welcoming too.
They've been very stoic up there, Your Majesty. It's been an extremely difficult time, and as I wrote to you, actually for those communities worse than the bushfires. It's absolutely terrible.
You've had a terrible lot of rain, haven't you?
Yes, and it's continuing, unfortunately. And one who had a bit of experience as well as that, if I could introduce Dr. Daniel Noor again, our Young Australian of the Year. Daniel, if you would tell the Majesty your story.
Good morning, Your Majesty. It is an absolute honour and privilege to be speaking to you and to see you live. My name is Daniel Noor. I'm currently a doctor working in one of Sydney's largest hospitals, where I've been working for the last 3 years. The reason I was awarded Young Australian of the Year was I founded a service called Streetside Medics. It is a mobile medical service that is providing GP-led medical access to those who are experiencing homelessness and those that are vulnerable. And it was actually an idea which started when I was a medical student at the Imperial College in London. I came across a gentleman who was having a seizure at Waterloo, just outside of the train station. And after that interaction, I learnt that for people experiencing homelessness, there are a number of quite significant and challenging barriers that limit access to healthcare. People experiencing homelessness, there are a number of quite significant and challenging barriers that limit access to healthcare. And the result of that limited access for those that I can treat and that are preventable. But the challenge was getting to see a doctor or getting to the hospital. And when I returned to Australia, I realised that despite us having one of the world's best healthcare services, we also had a number of those challenging barriers that limit access to healthcare. So what we've developed is a van which we've custom built as a mobile medical centre full of medical equipment and consumables. We have a team of over 200, 300 general practitioners and then about 6,000 volunteers. And we take our vans all across New South Wales and soon to be Australia. And we ensure that anyone who is experiencing homelessness or vulnerable has access to healthcare with absolutely no cost and no barriers limiting that access. And our service is very much one driven by need. And an example of that need was Lismore, where there was, as mentioned, devastating floods. And what the floods caused was medical centres were destroyed. General practitioners lost their ability to see patients, but worse, patients lost their ability to see doctors. And we just needed to do something about it. And for me as a doctor, it is the most fulfilling work. I mean, I still work in one of the largest hospitals. I'm training to do cardiology, hopefully soon. But there is nothing more fulfilling than serving those who are experiencing homelessness.
Well, I think that sounds wonderful work to be doing. Well, it's very nice to meet these very special Australians.
Your Majesty, I often use the phrase when we're travelling around about people with an enormous heart for community, and that's what you see here. And another phrase we often use in Government House is about richness of spirit in the Australian people. And I know the floods triggered a a little story Linda might want to tell you about some children we met in Brisbane.
It was their family owned a delicatessen, like a very upmarket delicatessen. And it did suffer some of the flooding, but they were able to save a lot of their produce. And when we met them, they were up and running again. And they had 3 delightful children. And those children, they decided that they would bake some cakes and make some sandwiches and sell this delicious food and donate the money to the flood cause.
That's splendid, isn't that?
I think the combined of life in Australia, work that still needs to be done in our society to level the playing field for people. Shanna's work with alcoholism in the bush is absolutely vital because, people in isolation and so forth, they turn to alcohol. And her desire is that when people go into the bar or the first response to a problem is not to go to a beer, it's to go and seek help, and she can provide that.
And for a community to accept the choice that not drinking is absolutely okay. Yeah, embracing some change.
And the changes that Dylan can... Dylan is one of the most well-known faces in Australia. And not the best looking, I
was going to say, that's a big call.
One of the most well-known faces. And he has at the moment this enormous... He's getting 200 invitations a day or requests a day to go and speak to organisations and people. So he's got tremendous potential to change people's views about disability in Australia. And Val is the epitome of volunteerism.
She's a dynamo.
50 years in St John.
It's a long time, isn't it?
A real stalwart. And...
yes, ma'am.
But not 70 years like you, ma'am, though. But no. 50 is getting close.
I have a few years yet to catch up with you, I think.
Oh, you're by 20.
And Daniel, of course, again, an enormous heart for people who go without. And as Daniel says, it's those simple illnesses that people have that are quite treatable, which are quite limiting to them in trying to, break out of homelessness. So I hope you've enjoyed getting a sense of what are the issues in modern day Australia that people are really worried about and working on. And we've got 4 extraordinary people here who are helping out.
Seems like it. And it's been wonderful to have... how lucky we get technology and I can speak to you all, which is splendid nowadays, isn't it?
Certainly is.
So it's been very interesting to hear about all the very important work which they're doing, which I hope they'll continue. There's
also great internet at the Palace because it is beautiful reception. It's coming through very good. The technology's great.
Good. Well, I'm glad because there's a whole lot of things happening outside the window and you can't hear it, luckily.
That's good.
And this technology is getting better. Anyway, it's very nice to meet you all.
But thank you very much for your time. And again, it's been just a lovely opportunity to catch up, to celebrate what has been a magnificent 70 years. And Australians are, I think, full of joy for what's coming up in terms of the celebrations, and just wishing you well over that period. And you never know, we might even get over there to celebrate.
Yeah, let's go.
Very nice to see you again. Yes. Righto. It's lovely to see you all.
Thank you very much, Your Majesty.
Bye.
Good morning.
Val, you just had a Zoom meeting with the Queen. How do you feel?
It is far greater than any dream I could have ever had. So what a privilege. Thank you.
I honestly couldn't stop thinking about the years of service Her Majesty has put in, and I feel inspired to keep going.
And she's cheeky. I love the cheeky smile, and she just wanted to have a chat, and so down to earth and lovely, so really amazing.
We which is pretty cool, I'm not going to lie. And she was lovely. She was so lovely, and what a huge honour to be able to represent the whole of Australia. I think the six of us were pretty lucky. We really were, and something I'll remember forever.
India, a powerhouse of culture, politics, diversity. And it's time to take a close-up look.
I'm Mark Fennell. Join me and a panel of guests every Monday night for a new show, India Now.
We'll bring you the key issues and latest news from the subcontinent, exploring everything that makes India and its neighbours the region to watch. We've got more than 1.8 billion stories to tell. India Now, Monday nights on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Some people search for it, others hide from it, from household names to people who have found themselves in the spotlight. Join me, Courtney Act, on 1+1 as I speak to well-known Australians about what fame means to them.
1+1 with Courtney Act, Thursday 9:35 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Join innovators and trailblazers.
How about this for our first date?
For one final trip down memory lane.
I started choreographing my first work here. Wow.
This is like where I grew up.
God, it hasn't changed.
Plus, the most emotional homecoming yet.
What a privilege to be part of this.
In Julia Zamiro's very own home delivery.
Oh my goodness. I would have loved to walk through here with him.
Starts Sunday, June 19 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
What is in this constitution and how will it benefit us?
It'll be my job to bring people together.
I do really believe there is a deep reservoir of goodwill, and I think that transcends left or right.
Coming up, Virginia Trioli looks at the future of the arts sector with Tony Burke, Darren Hayes, Adam Liao and Katie Noonan, who will also perform live.
Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Pedal Pal, the Prime Minister visits Indonesia, promising to return for the G20 Leaders Summit. Partygate catches up with the UK Prime Minister, with Conservative MPs forcing a no-confidence vote. Australian Minjee Lee claims the biggest title in women's golf with a dominant victory at the US Open.
I mean, this is pretty special. This is the one that I've always wanted to win since I was a little kid.
And after proving once more why he's the king of clay, Rafael Nadal reveals his playing future is in doubt. Hello and welcome to ABC Late News. I'm Michael Tetlow. Anthony Albanese will go to the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali later this year, despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's possible attendance. The Prime Minister made the promise during his first state visit to Indonesia, where he and President Joko Widodo agreed to strengthen economic and strategic ties. Political reporter Jay Norman is in Jakarta.
Two leaders in tandem. Australia's new Prime Minister welcomed in unique style.
It's a bamboo bike. Beautiful bamboo bike.
A presidential nod to both men's humble beginnings. From bicycles to botany, and finally bilateral talks on the grounds of Bagore's lush presidential palace. Anthony Albanese's seeking the deepest of ties with Australia's largest neighbour and confirming he'll be back later this year.
I will attend the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali in November. The work of the G20 is critical at this time of global economic uncertainty.
I am happy that Indonesia is the destination for Prime Minister Albanese's first bilateral visit.
The Prime Minister's following a familiar flight path to his predecessors. It was Malcolm Turnbull who forged the closest of bonds with Jokowi.
Well, that's a very good idea. Great idea.
Paving the way for a trade deal to be inked by Scott Morrison. But still, Australia's economic partnership with this country of 270 million is yet to reach its full potential. So, Mr Albanese's brought reinforcements, frontbenchers, including Australia's first Muslim cabinet minister, and a bevy of business leaders.
We have enormous opportunity for growth. Indonesia is going to be a top 5 economy in the globe.
As the Prime Minister prepared to leave for Indonesia, fresh tensions flared with Beijing, with confirmation a Chinese fighter jet had come perilously close to downing an Australian Air Force plane over the South China Sea.
We regard the actions of China in this area as being an act of aggression and a dangerous act.
Indonesia's largest trading partner is China, but Jakarta has made it clear it's not picking sides in the great power rivalry playing out on its doorstep. But as the biggest democracy among Southeast Asian nations, Indonesia will be critical in defending the rules-based order in a region facing pressure from an autocratic Beijing. Jane Norman, ABC News, Jakarta.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will face the biggest test of his leadership in the coming hours when his party holds a confidence vote. The Conservative leader has resisted calls from dozens of Tory politicians to resign over a series of parties held at Downing Street during a strict COVID lockdown. At least 54 MPs have written letters to trigger the ballot. The results will be known in the morning, Australian time. If Mr Johnson survives the vote, he won't face another challenge for a year. Queen Elizabeth has delighted celebrating crowds with a surprise appearance on the final day of festivities, marking her 70 years on the throne. The 96-year-old monarch had only appeared twice during the four-day Platinum Jubilee, but she wrapped up the celebration on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with the future of the royal family clearly on display. Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins has more.
The Jubilee Parade had all the pomp and pageantry fit for a queen. Her Majesty appeared as a hologram, waving to the crowds from the 260-year-old state coach that carried her to her coronation in 1953. But the military procession soon took on a street carnival vibe, with displays representing the 7 decades of the Queen's reign. There was plenty of colour and even more cheer. Characters from the super quirky to supermodels. The young royals watched on, a playful Prince Louis, not content to stay in his seat, finally settling for his granddad's knee. But it was the Queen herself who stole the show. After 2 days out of the spotlight due to mobility issues, she was back, flanked by 3 generations of royals, a rock star turnout for a long reigning monarch.
Really quite emotional. My nan brought me to the Golden Jubilee when I was a child, and it was something that always stuck with me, so I wanted to bring my kids along to witness the same thing.
The Queen's surprise appearance on the balcony might have buoyed crowds, but her absence throughout the weekend was noticed. This country saw much more of Prince Charles and Prince William, with commentators saying a transition is already underway in the British monarchy. In the royal gardens at Windsor, there was plenty of party spirit.
We will attempt the world's longest loyal toast.
Many here hope to one day see a king in the castle.
I'll be happy for Charles. He's been king in waiting for a very long time.
The Platinum Jubilee will long live in the national memory. As the Queen plans for the future of the institution, she served for more than 70 years. Isabella Higgins, ABC News, London.
The New South Wales government has announced it's lifting the public sector pay rise cap to 3%. It's the news workers had been waiting for, but not the amount they wanted.
After months of calls for better wages, a fortnight out from the budget, the government has made its pitch.
Our wages policy for the next 12 months will be an increase of 3% for public sector wages in New South Wales.
That will be followed by another 3% in the next financial year, with an extra 0.5% on offer for those who improve efficiency and productivity.
It balances the competing interests that we have as a state after what we've gone through over the last 2 years.
It's the first time the cap on public sector wages increases has been lifted in more than a decade. But with inflation above 5%, the unions say it's not enough.
That is a wage cut, and we will not tolerate a wage cut.
At the same time, the government unveiled a boost to health. $4.5 billion will be spent employing 10,000 staff over the next 4 years.
In the next 12 months, we're aiming to bring in about 7,600 staff.
The opposition leader is sceptical.
At the last state election, the government promised 5,000 additional nurses. There's still 2,500 positions short.
Unless there's a real increase in the numbers of nurses and midwives on every shift, then today's announcement is going to be pretty hollow.
The state's healthcare workers are also set to receive a $3,000 thank you for their efforts through COVID. Other frontline workers say they have been left behind.
It is the public sector generally that the community turn to in times of crisis. So why on earth is he picking winners and losers in that?
The one-off payment will go to all New South Wales health employees who worked on a permanent basis through the pandemic. That includes paramedics, midwives and cleaners. The Treasurer says the full cost of today's announcement will be revealed in the budget. Ruby Cornish, ABC News, Sydney.
Google has been ordered to pay former New South Wales Deputy Premier John Barilaro nearly $750,000. The former MP sued Google in the federal court over its failure to remove 2 videos made by comedian Jordan Shanks, known as Friendly Geordies, which were published in late 2020. The judge awarded Mr Barilaro $715,000, finding the videos Google failed to remove contained disgusting hate speech.
And it's a little bit traumatising, but I'm happy it's the end of the journey.
Last year, the retired politician settled against Mr Shanks after he apologised and edited some of the videos. Russia has launched a missile strike on Ukraine's capital Kiev for the first time in more than a month. Russia said the strikes destroyed tanks supplied by Eastern European countries, but Ukrainian authorities said it was a train repair shop with no military equipment. The Russian president has warned any Western deliveries of longer-range rocket systems will prompt Moscow to strike new targets.
If they are going to be supplied, we'll make certain conclusions and use our own means of destruction, which we will have enough to strike at those targets which we have not yet been hitting.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met troops on the front line in his first visit to the Donbass region since the start of the invasion. At least 50 people have been killed and many injured after gunmen attacked a Catholic church in southwestern Nigeria. They fired into worshippers at St Francis Church in Ondo State during Sunday Mass. Many women and children were among the dead, but the bishop and priests from the parish reportedly survived. Nigeria is battling an Islamic insurgency in the northeast, but Ondo is widely known as one of Nigeria's most peaceful states. At least 49 people have been killed in a fire at a container depot in southeastern Bangladesh. Drone footage captured rows of burnt-out shipping containers as efforts to extinguish the fire continued into a second night. At least 9 firefighters were among those killed and more than 200 people were injured. Bangladesh has a history of industrial disasters, with monitoring groups blaming corruption and lax safety conditions. Education options for students with a disability are under the spotlight this week as the Royal Commission sits in Canberra. Advocates are pushing for inclusive education, but parents say there needs to be choice. National Disability Affairs reporter Elizabeth Wright explains.
Georgina Moody always expected her boys would attend their local primary school, but after 6 months, it wasn't working for her youngest son, Will.
Like they would lose him out on the street. I mean, it was terrible.
Oh, that tastes good. Both boys have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Georgina moved Will to a special school.
He went into an environment where he is understood and appreciated.
Young people with The Disability Royal Commission is examining the experiences of children and young people in different education settings, including special schools.
We talk about
segregated learning and we talk about mainstream. Why does there have to be two?
About 1 in 10 school students live with disability. 89% attend mainstream schools. The rest attend one of Australia's almost 500 special schools. Some advocates say special education is a form of segregation.
We need to frame this as students with disability are not a problem. They are an equal citizen of our schools and they require adjustments, but that is their right.
Powerful evidence is expected from the many lived experience witnesses. While opinion differs over mainstream and special schools, all agree that more resources are needed.
Because we don't want to be guinea pigs anymore, which is what we feel like. We're constantly a training tool.
After seeing Will thriving at his special school, Georgina moved her eldest son Tom there for Year 6.
There needs to be a choice. Unfortunately, society is not particularly embracing or inclusive or accepting of disability.
The hearing runs till Friday. Elizabeth Wright, ABC News.
Millions of workers in the gig economy and casuals are hopeful the Albanese government will bring more stable employment. Labor has an ambitious industrial relations reform agenda, but some businesses say the government's plans won't work.
It's not a good time to be employed through an app or on contract after contract.
Fuel prices and all the living costs comes up.
It's stressful. It's a juggle. It's a juggle with time, it's a juggle with money and the budget.
The new government has promised substantial changes to work laws.
They're potentially massive. We're talking about everything from security of employment right through to the gender pay gap.
Labor has promised to enshrine secure work and gender pay equity in workplace laws, to legislate a cap on rolling contracts and set a minimum pay level for gig economy workers such as delivery drivers.
That will just keep us safe, secure.
Those who operate online platforms say the gig economy is different.
Mabel is not setting the terms of those engagements. We're not establishing rates. It's the small businesses engaging directly with their clients.
Business groups don't see a problem.
Job security has arguably never been better. We have an unemployment rate of 3.9%. We have employment growing.
Hi, Frida.
For years, Janine worked as a contractor or temp, without holidays, sick pay or superannuation.
You're usually going from paycheck to paycheck, so planning is just keeping a roof over your head. It's really the basics.
Now in a secure role, she hopes others will get the same stability.
Housing, education, future prospects. They'd just be able to live a more secure life.
The new government has proposed a jobs summit in September, but first it has to make its case for the minimum wage to be raised to match soaring inflation. Daniel Ziffer, ABC News.
New COVID cases in WA have fallen to their lowest level in nearly 3 months, with the state reporting fewer than 5,000 new infections. But while the state's Omicron wave fades, the impact of the pandemic in Perth's CBD is badly hurting some businesses.
Not everything is as it seems at Nancy Feng's Perth Cafe, including her usual customers.
To be honest, we don't really focus on the business people here.
Even though she's at the base of a 12-storey office building, she's used social media and some unique offerings to entice customers in.
Especially with our desserts as well, you probably can't see anywhere in Perth. So everything here is unique.
It means she hasn't missed CBD workers who've chosen to work at home, particularly when masks were mandatory. But on the opposite side of the terrace, Anthony Arnold's had a different view from behind his coffee machine.
It's still probably about 50% away to a third away from where it was beforehand, but definitely noticing, a difference week to week.
Data gathered by tech giant Google shows since the start of the year, the number of people working from city offices has been trending down. It picked up slightly after mask mandates were lifted, but is still below pre-pandemic levels.
I think you'll probably see the closure of a lot of venues, particularly. You've already seen a lot disappear.
And with some of WA's largest employers sticking with flexible work policies, the number of office workers in the CBD may never fully recover, leading to a raft of changes.
There'll probably be open desk offices and probably a smaller floor area than they would have needed with all their staff there.
That might make things tough for CBD retail and hospitality in the short term, but increasing numbers of apartments could change that.
You know, at the moment you are serving the working population between 9 and 5, and you're closed overnight and over the weekends. Whereas if you get more residents within the CBD, then you have that after-hours business as well.
In the short term, the government's hoping it can entice people back with money for events by revitalising Yagan Square. But any significant change will take some time, leaving a difficult road ahead for many CBD businesses. Keith Burke, ABC News.
West Australian Minjee Lee has won the biggest prize in women's golf, taking out the US Open by 4 shots. Lee claimed her second major and picked up $2.5 million, the largest prize money in the history of the women's game.
What a champion.
Walking up the 18th fairway, Minjee Lee was living a scenario she'd acted out as a young girl on golf courses in Western Australia.
I for sure have done it. This is to win the US Open, like for a little 5-footer.
She just ran away from everybody. Minjee Lee.
The 26-year-old joins her mentor, Kari Webb, and Jan Stevenson as the only Australians to win the tournament.
It's such a great honour just to be amongst those two names.
Her younger brother, fellow golf professional Min Woo Lee, was brought to tears, and he won't be the only one inspired by the triumph.
I think this will be huge for all the little girls and even the boys and the children watching.
Lee started her final round with a 3-shot lead over American Mina Haragai and adopted an aggressive approach to extend the advantage.
Rolls in a long birdie putt.
On the 12th hole, the Perth-born player had one hand on the trophy.
Oh, it's a clinic. Wonderful.
Her coach believes Lee deserves a higher profile.
She's now a 2-time major winner. In any other sport, it'd probably be very well known.
Smith says the Women's US Open has set the standard by nearly doubling its total prize money.
There's still 4 majors that are well behind in terms of funding. What we need to realise is that the women work just as hard as the men.
While the winner's cheque will be welcomed, it was the trophy Lee was after.
This is pretty special. This is the one that I've always wanted to win since I was a little kid.
Lee moves to number 2 in the rankings while feeling on top of the world. Duncan Huntsdale, ABC News.
Rafael Nadal has won his 14th French Open Tennis Championship over Norway's Casper Ruud. The 36-year-old now has 2 more Grand Slam victories than his great rivals Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer. But Nadal has revealed he had to play with numbing injections to overcome a chronic condition in his foot that could end his stellar career. National Sport reporter David Mark has the story.
He's done it again. It's a historic 14th Roland Garros title for Nadal.
Every win for Rafael Nadal is creating new records, but this French Open might be the most precious of all his 22 Grand Slams.
Means a lot to me, means everything.
His opponent, Casper Ruud, tried.
Oh, yeah.
But the man who once trained at Nadal's own academy could do little to stop the onslaught, losing 6-3, 6-3, 6-love.
Too good.
I got to feel how it is to play against you in the final, and it's not easy, and I'm not the first victim.
Nadal was playing his own body as much as Ruud, revealing after the match he had injections in his left foot to blunt the pain from a chronic bone condition.
I have no feelings on my foot. My daughter was able to put anesthetic injections on the nerves.
But he's not prepared to do it again, even if it means missing Wimbledon.
If I am able to play with anti-inflammatories, yes. To play with anesthetic injections, no.
He plans to try to burn 2 nerves in his foot, and if that doesn't work, he says he may consider surgery as a final option.
I don't know what can happen in the future, but I'm gonna keep fighting to try to keep going, so many thanks.
At 36, and with a body crying out for him to stop, this may have been Rafael Nadal's last farewell. But if so, he was on the court that allowed him to become, numerically at least, the greatest in history.
I hope, we all hope that you will continue for some more time.
All tennis fans are hoping the same. David Mark, ABC News.
This week, the Maroons will look to do something they haven't done in 5 years. Beat the Blues in Sydney. The side has arrived in the harbour city, hoping to launch a new Queensland era with a big upset on Wednesday.
Touching down in enemy territory with one goal in mind, deliver a blow to the Blues in their Sydney homecoming. Fans are hard to come by across the border.
Obviously you enjoy every part of what the camp brings and what Origin brings, but the ultimate moment is when you run out and you get to play. That's the best part.
The game plan has been plotted and trained. Now all that's left to do is execute.
Billy and his staff have definitely put, their spin on it. What they believe is going to help us play well on Wednesday night, and everyone's really bought into that style of footy.
A style of footy which Cherry Evans is confident brings out the best of his Maroon side, which includes determined forwards, naturally gifted backs, and a playmaker who's dangerous but a larrikin.
Cameron Munster probably needs a kick up the arse every now and then, and Billy gives him that when he needs one, but that's what makes camp so energetic and so enjoyable to be around in camp.
Right on cue, mid-press conference.
Every game. See? That's what I'm talking about. He's still the same idiot that we all love.
In Sydney now, but the Maroons hope when they come to Brisbane for Game 3, they've either wrapped the series up or are playing in a decider.
But honestly, it's all about just going out there and coming together, playing good footy.
It's a sentiment which will be echoed by Queensland's women's side, unveiled today, the 22-woman squad headlined by 40-year-old Titans forward Steph Hancock.
She bleeds maroon and you can see that when she's training and her efforts that she puts in.
The clash in Canberra on Friday, June 24, will be the last one-off Women's Origin match between the states.
Currently, we're sitting on 2 games for next year and pushing for it to go to 3 the year after that.
Jessica Stewart, ABC News.
4 Dockers and 4 Brisbane Lions have been fined over a fight during Fremantle's victory at Perth Stadium. Luke Ryan, Jordan Clark, Lloyd Meek and Lockie Schultz have each been offered $1,000 fines. From Brisbane, Brandon Starcevich, Noah Answorth, Harris Andrews and Devon Robertson have received the same sanction. The incident happened in the second quarter of the match. The Dockers' triumph saw the team move within percentage points of the Lions in the race for second spot on the ladder. In one of the biggest blunders seen in MotoGP, Spanish rider Aleix Espargaro has missed out on a podium finish at the Catalonia Grand Prix after thinking the race was over a lap before it ended. The Spaniard lifted off the throttle and started to wave to fans in celebration at the Barcelona-Catalunya circuit when he crossed the line on the second-to-last lap. Espargaro was in second place at the time, behind eventual winner Fabio Quartararo.
What a howler by Aleix Espargaro. We thought it was a mechanical. He thought the race was over. He's made an incredible miscalculation.
The 32-year-old realised his mistake a few turns later and immediately went back to racing, eventually finishing in 5th spot. It happens to the best of us now. Time for the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
A chilly southwesterly wind and a few showers each day this week in the southeast, thanks to the high that's barely moving. And embedded cold fronts will continue to move up as well. In the west, it'll be mostly dry until later on Wednesday when that low pressure system and some troughs move closer to the coast, and then it'll be wet along the west coast right through into the weekend. A few showers in North Queensland with onshore winds, and showers especially along the coast tomorrow between Cairns and Mackay, and the tablelands south of Mareeba, partly cloudy in Brisbane. In New South Wales, showers about the ranges and western slopes spreading across southern inland. Snow on the southern Alps lowering to 700 metres by the evening. Mostly clear elsewhere, including Sydney. In Canberra, a shower or 2. Showers in Victoria will ease inland during the afternoon. They will fall as snow above 700 metres. And in Tasmania, snow down to 300 metres from the afternoon. Showers mostly in the west, south, central areas and Bass Strait Islands and in Hobart. Showers over South Australia's agricultural areas and the the far south of the Flinders district. In Adelaide, showers mostly falling in the morning. Most of Western Australia will be in the clear, but maybe a shower over the Gascoyne, far west Pilbara coasts and near the south coast east of Walpole. In Perth, mostly sunny. And to the Territory, showers and thunderstorms across the northeast Arnhem district and the northeast Gove Peninsula. But Darwin, though, mostly sunny.
Thank you, Paul. That is ABC Late News to the Moments. I'm Michael Tetlow. Take care. Bye for now.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
What is in this Constitution and how will it benefit us?
It'll be my job to bring people together.
I do really believe there is a deep reservoir of goodwill, and I think that transcends left or right.
Coming up, Virginia Trioli looks at the future of the arts sector with Tony Burke, Darren Hayes, Adam Liao and Katie Noonan, who will also perform live.
Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Welcome to the program. Even though Australia is one of the world's biggest energy producers, the country's east coast is grappling with a gas crisis. Some manufacturing businesses have seen their bills soar in the past 2 months, and they're surviving on a day-by-day basis. The increasing energy costs could add to Australia's inflation woes. Here's political reporter James Glenday.
New South Wales town of Young is famous for its cherries. But for several decades, it's also been manufacturing an important product used across Australia in industry and agriculture.
The white stuff is the really good stuff. Yeah. That's the magnesium. Yeah.
If you've ever eaten Australian cheese, there's a chance some of the minerals in it originally came from these rocks. They're burned at a very high temperature to produce magnesium oxide, which is often used as a supplement to prevent a potentially deadly deficiency in milk-producing cows.
We're very proud to say that we've been one of the largest and most consistent employers in the town of Young. Our company has been established here for more than 70 years.
But Cosmag International is an energy-intensive operation, currently bleeding cash and customers. It estimates its kiln uses more than 80% of Young's gas. Its provider, Western Energy, was last month forced to shut its doors as prices surged, and Cosmag now says it's paying 3.5 times more for gas than it was just 2 months ago.
The cost of gas at the moment for some of our products is actually more than the cost of the product itself. It sounds unbelievable, but that's the case today.
Due to the sudden price jump, only a small number of customers are continuing to place orders. And if this plant has to shut down, even temporarily, it'll likely lose skilled workers that would be extremely difficult to replace in a town like Young.
Well, it's been nothing short of a miracle that we're still around. We are losing money big time because our customers are sourcing their products from our competitors, and most of these products are actually made in China and imported into Australia.
Prices are high globally because European countries are looking for non-Russian sources of gas due to the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine. Back in Australia, that's coincided with a sudden cold snap, which has driven a spike in demand for gas heating. At the same time, more than a quarter of coal-fired power stations have recently experienced outages, meaning gas generators are facing more demand to help keep the nation's lights on, driving prices up even further.
Well, we've been in government for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. We had 9 years of neglect from a government. Remember they used to talk about the gas-led recovery? They talked about that for years. Well, where is it?
After a decade of political climate wars, this gas price spike poses a very tricky problem for the new Labor government, and there doesn't appear to be a quick or easy fix. Industry warns jobs and local manufacturing capability are on the line. Some of the poorest Australians are bracing for bill shock this winter, and the high prices may further fuel inflation, adding to the pain being felt in households across the country. The situation baffles some minor party and independent politicians who say it is ridiculous that Australia, one of the world's biggest gas exporters, is facing a domestic gas price crisis.
We produce more gas than you can poke a stick at. It is not fair to say that there is a gas shortage in Australia. We produce about 2.5 times the amount of gas we use. The problem is that we export too much. That's what needs to be solved.
Gas prices in Western Australia are currently much cheaper than on the East Coast. The state forces big multinational companies to reserve around 15% of the gas produced for domestic use. Outgoing South Australian Senator Rex Patrick wants the government to implement a similar scheme in Eastern Australia.
It's our gas, it belongs to Australians, and Australians are entitled to a fair and reasonable price for what belongs to them.
There are also calls for Labor to pull an emergency trigger that was set up 5 years ago. It would see more gas provided for domestic use, but not until next January. And over the past week, the new minister has remained non-committal.
The government will take whatever action is necessary based on advice. We are not today ruling out or in any particular action going forward over and above what I've announced today.
Anthony Albanese's team has made it clear it won't rush things and is well aware that suddenly diverting exports could cause diplomatic or trade problems with our allies in Asia who have signed long-term contracts for our gas and are also dealing with inflationary pressures of their own.
The oil and gas sector is making extraordinary profits.
In Britain, Boris Johnson's Conservative government has partly funded a cost of living package for families and businesses struggling with bills by slapping a windfall tax on energy companies. Some analysts believe it's an idea worth exploring here.
I think the government ought to consider a windfall tax. A lot of the gains to Australian gas and coal exporters are a windfall. They are not a consequence of their clever management.
Unsurprisingly, the resources industry doesn't think a new tax is necessary, and the Labor government has already indicated it is unlikely to pursue the idea. It does have strong memories of the campaign it faced over the mining and carbon taxes when it was last in office, while the opposition, licking its wounds after a big election defeat, is rejecting suggestions it should have dealt better with rising gas prices when it was in power.
Something needs to be done right away because this problem has been festering for the last 2.5 months and it's happened repeatedly over the last 5 years and it will keep happening unless something is done permanently to fix this problem.
Small manufacturers like Corsmag in Young have no time for political bickering. They just want some sort of assistance so they can afford to keep paying their gas bills, and they want it now.
We don't have a problem switching over to renewables, but the fact is that at the moment, there's no such option for a company like us and for hundreds of other companies all over Australia.
Hospitals around the country are struggling to get back to anything like what they were before the COVID pandemic. Healthcare workers say they're under unprecedented pressure with a perfect storm of surging demand, workforce shortages and a daunting backlog of medical needs caused by lockdowns. Lauren Day reports.
You kind of have to be a little bit kooky to be into infectious diseases anyway. It was quite a happy ward, I think, a very strong team. Compared to now, it's a bit of a daily grind, really.
Nurse Grace Carroll spent 2 years on the front line of the COVID pandemic at a major Melbourne hospital. But she says things are even worse now.
I feel like it's busier now than it has been ever. Every morning you come in and there's at least 100 patients in emergency. That's day in, day out. So no, definitely the pandemic's not over.
We've got this perfect storm of staff shortages, increased demand that we knew that was going to come, and then also significantly increased demand in terms of COVID and flu.
Now is not the time to get sick in Australia.
I would describe what's happening right now as a crisis. I work in the emergency department and our emergency departments are absolutely overflowing. But the problem is that we can't move our patients out into hospital beds that have enough staff working in them to look after patients safely. And because we can't move patients out, we can't offload patients from our ambulances who are then ramped outside our hospitals for many hours and can't respond to patients that they need to see in the community.
Nowhere is immune to this crisis. Most states and territories aim to get 90% of patients out of ambulances and into care within 30 to 40 minutes. Last year, not a single one reached that goal. The ACT, Western Australia and South Australia were the worst performers. And in Victoria, ABC News recently revealed up to 1 in 5 patients last year just gave up and left the emergency department without treatment.
It's just been relentless. Any patient that you discharge, there's 3 waiting in emergency to come up.
Nurse Grace Carroll has already had COVID twice, but last month she had to take leave for a different reason. Burnt out and exhausted, she was finally tipped over the edge when she was abused by a patient's family.
I just couldn't stop crying, like sobbing, crying. We are short-staffed and we are working so hard, but when you keep cupping that every day, you're gonna break at some point.
She's not alone. Report after report has found staggering rates of burnout among Australian healthcare workers. One study during the pandemic of over 9,000 frontline healthcare workers found 57% of the workforce was struggling with depression, almost 60% anxiety, and 70% moderate to severe burnout.
I can't see the end of the tunnel, that the resource is being able to compensate for the increased demand. The issues have always been there before COVID. However, COVID has really shown what the cracks are systemically.
Sydney nurse Hayley Chandler has made the difficult decision to leave the industry after working throughout the pandemic.
Feeling burnt out, you obviously sort of bring those emotions home, and I also felt quite bad in talking to patients that I felt that I wasn't giving them the level of care that I would like to give, just simply because I was stretched to my absolute thinnest.
She's now studying law and believes others will leave the industry unless something is done to fix workforce shortages and huge workloads.
People are going to want to look for work elsewhere because they're going to want to be adequately supported within their workplace and feel as though they're safe at work.
Practitioners are all thinking, why am I doing this? It's not actually good for my health and may in fact be dangerous.
After 30 years in medicine, Professor John Wilson is joining the exodus. He says he could no longer work in what he describes as a failing system.
Healthcare in Australia has been taken for granted. It'll always be there, but that can't happen anymore. We're not in a situation where this could get worse. It is worse now.
We need the funding that's been put into COVID from the federal government to the states to be extended right now. We need that tomorrow. Long term, we need a commitment for federal government to fund 50-50 the public hospital systems, and we need to removal of that 6.5% cap.
In a statement, the new Federal Health Minister said he'd work through the issues with state premiers. 730 also reached out to all state and territory health departments. Most acknowledged the serious pressures their staff are under and detailed their plans for addressing workforce shortages. All urged their staff to seek support services if they were struggling.
We know that the stresses of medicine have really significant implications on the mental health of junior and senior doctors right throughout the system. So the increased stresses that the health systems that they work in are under, you can only imagine what that's doing to their mental health.
When you have long hours, the night duties, and also the social isolation that arises because you can't plan a social life easily. That combination of things are all risk factors for mental illness.
I'd like to show you Tasha's room.
Indrani Tamanasan knows the extreme consequences of the pressures healthcare workers face. Her daughter, Dr. Tasha Port, died by suicide in the first year of the pandemic.
Tasha is not defined by her depression, and I do not wish her to be defined by that. But her illness did kill her, and for that reason, I feel we need to keep talking of who she was and how she died, and hopefully with that, we can change things for the better for others.
Tasha, a third-year junior doctor, had a long battle with depression and the stigma that surrounded it.
We believe the reason was that she felt she couldn't get into the pediatric program. But if you had an environment that didn't have all those risk factors worsening her mental health, would she have got to that point, putting her in the pain that she must have been in? And we've got all the photos of her in that last year or so.
Dr. Tasha Port's parents have just marked 2 years since her death, the hardest 2 years of their lives. They want the system to better care for those who care for us.
I really do want to talk about how we can change working environments to make hospitals and doctors and a profession of medicine which is supposed to be caring and compassionate. I want it to be more caring and compassionate for its own community.
You can find full statements from the Federal Health Minister and Federal and State Health Departments on our website. And if any of our coverage tonight has raised issues for you, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14. It's been 4 months since Australia's border reopened to the world and international tourists are slowly trickling back to our shores. But the industry says a full recovery is still up to 12 months away. Jason Om reports.
Fortress Australia is no more, with the borders open again. But in Sydney Harbour, it's a slow climb to recovery for one of the city's top tourist attractions.
All right, on three, say cheese. 1, 2, 3.
I'm really happy that tourism is back on. It is really nice to be able to travel. I'm just looking forward to see what the world has to offer to me.
After the global shock of the pandemic, Australia's battered tourism operators are hoping for bright spots ahead for the $60 billion industry.
When the border shut, it just meant that 80% of the business disappeared overnight.
It's slowly though, with the majority of tourists climbing the Sydney Harbour Bridge still from the domestic market.
We couldn't keep going at this rate for an elongated period of time. But we are starting to see what we can see as the green shoots, and we're really hopeful. But for us, the litmus test really is December and January.
While it's been a fun day out for these sightseers, one of the nationalities missing here today is the Chinese. Before the pandemic, tourists from China were the largest group of visitors to Australia, about 1.5 million every year. But now, even with the borders reopened, that market has evaporated. The British are now the top visitors, while the Chinese stay at home. China's zero-COVID approach means citizens face tough restrictions on leaving the country for non-essential travel, leaving a $12 billion black hole in Australia's tourism industry.
They were the ones who spent the most. So essentially they spent something like $8,500 while they were here, and most other travellers would probably be somewhere down at the $4,000 and $5,000. And as for domestic travellers, probably about $1,500 if we're lucky. So you begin to see why the domestic marketplace can't necessarily fill the gap.
今天很高兴啊，那么各位贵宾跟我们一块去这个
Tour operator Jen Sun used to welcome hundreds of Chinese visitors to Sydney every year, but now he's had to switch to local Chinese Australians to make up for the shortfall.
There's no inbound customer from other countries, so that's a big challenge for us. We need to face this challenge. For example, we start the local tour, organize local tour for the local people. For our company, that's the way we survive during the pandemic. We feel a bit nervous or the stress because of the uncertainty of the timing when the Chinese customer will coming back. We welcome all of the Chinese coming back to Australia.
On the Great Barrier Reef, tourists are slowly returning to Cairns, and boat operator Perry Jones is busy again.
Brilliant.
Great.
Thank you.
Absolutely amazing.
Thank you very much. I reckon we've seen a 10% increase in internationals. We are hearing the voices. We're hearing voices again, which is amazing. It's brought life back into Cairns. It's given us a reason to get out of bed and to actually do stuff.
During the border closures, Perry took out loans to keep his business afloat. The coming summer will be make or break.
In total, I've had to borrow an extra $850,000 to keep going over these last 2.5 years. So, that's another debt on top of all the other debts I've got. And that got me through the pandemic. Going forward, it's all about bums on seats to actually get money in the pocket. So we really, really need to see a big upturn.
It's been hard going for some visitors to get into the country, with the Home Affairs Department bogged down in a backlog of tourist visa applications since the borders shut. The department says processing times have improved from 20 months to 37 days, but some applicants have been waiting months.
Happy birthday. We love you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Queenslander Leonora Luff's relatives in the Philippines applied for tourist visas in January, but they've heard nothing since. She hasn't seen her niece Mariana for years and has never met her 1-year-old nephew.
We want to come here soon. And I would do anything. If they can be here today, I would do anything that I can, for them to be here. It is very important for me because they're like my children. They're my joy. They're my world. Every day, checking the immigration account. Has it moved? Has it been updated? The stress to the family, the emotional toll, and the psychological toll, sometimes it can be unbearable.
The Home Affairs Department would not say when the delays would be cleared, but said applications are assessed on a case-by-case basis.
It is actually damaging our brand not to be able to get those visas out the door as quickly as possible in the most appropriate way.
At this Tourism Expo in Sydney, Australia is on sale to the world. International operators flying in for the first time in years. There's optimism travellers are ready to come back. It'll just take time, and for the rest of the world to open up again.
We have 550 sellers here. We have 550 buyers from 20 countries who are here right now, and that's pretty amazing.
The Albanese government has had nothing like a honeymoon in foreign policy, with tensions elevated by a Chinese fighter jet executing dangerous manoeuvres over the South China Sea, threatening the safety of an Australian surveillance plane. Hugh White is a professor at the Australian National University, a former senior defence official and author of the forthcoming quarterly essay, Sleepwalk to War. Hugh White, how do you assess the incident involving the Chinese aircraft and the Australian surveillance plane?
Well, I think the first thing it shows, Lee, is that any slack that the guys in Beijing were inclined to cut the new government here in Canberra has well and truly been exhausted. I think it does show that the pressure is back on. Obviously, there was a little bit of wiggle room given, particularly by Li Keqiang's reaching out to the new Prime Minister with that message of welcome. But I think we're back to the tough game, and it shows that they're not going to give us much space.
There was an incident in February when a Chinese naval ship shone a laser at an RAAF plane. Is this a pattern of intimidation?
Well, I think it's certainly showing that the Chinese are determined to demonstrate that they believe they have the right to operate as they wish around our part of the world, and that they're prepared to push back at what we see as our normal pattern of operations. And I think that's all part of a broader picture of China asserting itself as the strongest power in the Western Pacific and trying to find ways to encourage us to get used to that. And that's, in a sense, the big challenge for the new government, as it was for the old one, to work out how in the long run does Australia respond to that.
This is the first incident of this kind that Prime Minister Albanese has had to respond to. It almost certainly won't be the last. Have you noticed any difference in his use of language compared to the way that the former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, used to respond?
Yes, I do think Anthony Albanese went out of his way, certainly in his comments in Perth, to take a more moderate line than Scott Morrison did over that incident back in February. Morrison used some quite, aggressive language about that being, serious, dangerous incident. I think the language that Anthony Albanese used was designed to avoid getting into that kind of, escalating rhetorical conflict. But I do think, nonetheless, it shows that the long-term challenge that Albanese is going to face in trying to manage China's more assertive conduct is going to be very difficult for him.
Well, it's obviously in nobody's interest for tensions to escalate further, but what is the path to a reset of sorts?
Well, I think that's the $64 question. I think the big challenge for us is to find a way to come to terms with the fact that China is going to be a stronger and more assertive, in some ways more aggressive power in the Western Pacific, and we're going to have to find a way to live with that. Anthony Albanese sort of said that, well, it's China's that's changed, and that kind of carries the implication that we should wait for China to change back and that that's the way forward. I don't think China's going to change back. I think this is the new China we're going to have to learn to live with. And for Australia, that poses the question, are we happy to continue to have the kind of really dysfunctional relationship we have with Beijing today indefinitely into the future?
The Prime Minister's made his first bilateral trip today to Indonesia. What's the significance of that as a destination early on?
Well, it's a tradition, of course, that Australian political leaders go to Indonesia as the first visit. It's a way of symbolising the significance of Indonesia in Australian foreign policy, but in the past, at least, the symbolism has tended to be all there has been to it. I think most people would agree that our relationship with Indonesia has gone downhill over the last few years. It hasn't had anything like the priority and focus that it had, for example, under Paul Keating or Bob Hawke. And I think Indonesia is going to become more important to us in the years ahead, not just because of its importance as a regional country, but also in its own right. It's on track to becoming the fourth biggest economy in the world well before the middle of the century. And so I think the challenge for Albanese is to find a way to really put some substance into the symbolism of making Indonesia that first step. And I think it's also important that we start doing something that we haven't done for a long time in Jakarta, and that is just to listen to what they have to say.
Hugh White, thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure, Lee. Thank you.
Tom Hanks has to be one of the most universally loved actors on the planet, but in his latest role, he's playing one of the most polarising figures in entertainment history, Elvis Presley's promoter, Colonel Tom Parker. Many Elvis fans believe Parker exploited the music legend, contributing to his early death. The new film Elvis is directed by Baz Luhrmann, and his star, Tom Hanks, joined me from the Gold Coast. Tom Hanks, lovely to have you with us. When you're playing a person who did actually exist in reality, what kind of obligation, if any, do you feel that you have to them?
That's a real interesting question, because there is a fealty that you have to pay to the movie itself. You know, there are beats that are expected from the movie. There are motivations that you have to make happen, because otherwise you don't really have a story. And I was very lucky on this, is that because I gave the world COVID back in March of whatever that year was, 1,000 years ago. Everything we were doing was brought to a halt, including, I think, a lot of the direction of what the story was between Elvis and the Colonel. And that gave us about 6 months to ponder what the direction was going to be. And Baz and I had a protracted conversation about a month before we came back in order to continue on, in which we took each other to task over what we were doing in regards to the Colonel. Was he a cheap carny? Yes. Was he did he have an artistic bone in his body? No. But that belied the fact that he was not Elvis's manager. He was Elvis's promoter. And I think that in the work that we had done together, Baz and I and everything else, that we were able to put together, I think, a realistic approach to what a genius the Colonel was up until 1968.
I believe I can be great too.
Oh, no doubt. But we could be even greater together. But to achieve this, I need to represent you exclusively.
Exclusively? Sir, I don't follow.
When you're playing a real person, do you look for all of the answers about how to portray them in the script, or do you go away and do a whole lot of research more widely beyond that?
They have an awful lot of reference material that they can draw from, which is, look, that's a treasure trove as an actor. You know, if I could get film of anybody that have to play, if I can't meet them in person and try to inhabit their bones, so to speak. I will tell you that because of the COVID protocols, Austin and I never saw each other in the course of making this movie. On the days that we were shooting together, I did not see Austin as Elvis until he walked on the stage as Elvis.
Well, you may go to college, you may go to school, you may have a pink Cadillac, but don't you break nobody's rule now, baby, come back, baby, come.
Can you ever go anywhere, like sit on a train or something like that, and have a chat with a stranger and them not know who you are?
I can have a chat with a stranger, and I can do that, but chances are they know who I am, and that's an even cooler exchange, because they'll say, oh, there you are. Are you enjoying your day? How's the shooting going? We know you're here. Are you like it? You know, how are you feeling about Goldie? And I will have a conversation with them about their family, about their kids, and I do appreciate it because they don't make a big deal about what's going on. They sort of get it. I've been a celebrity long enough that I think I've been in people's houses, you know, since the advent of the VHS tape, so they're relatively familiar with me just enough. So I will say that I had any number of exchanges with folks who knew the job that I was going down here, or on vacation themselves, or they make this their home. And we were able to have, I had any number of nice exchanges. I had the other kind too, you know, that were like, hi, how are you? No, sorry, I can only do so much, and then beat a hasty retreat. But when the other thing happens, I always appreciate folks that recognize what's going on. I mean, let's not be silly. I know what I do for a living, and their willingness to just ask, you know, regular questions they would ask of anybody waiting to get a coffee, you know, or a flat white. Do you enjoy the flat whites, Tom? That's always a nice exchange.
It must be lovely that your work connects with people.
You know, it's always the thing that's most important is, you know, what their connection was to a movie. I think, like you, I can probably tell you where I was and what theater I saw, any movie that is memorable to me. And I find that people